I decided to go camping alone in the summer of 2017. I had been working nonstop for almost 8 months at a construction company in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Between long shifts and weekend calls, I barely had time to breathe, let alone relax. I remember sitting at my desk one evening, covered in dirt and sawdust, and just booking the trip on my phone without thinking too hard about it. I picked a remote campground in southern Colorado near the edge of the Rio Grande National Forest. It wasn't a full-on campsite with designated plots or running water, just a clearing you could hike into, set up your tent, and be left alone. That's exactly what I wanted. No noise, no people, no distractions. I packed everything carefully the night before I left. I brought a solid tent, sleeping bag, my old backpacking stove, 2 headlamps, plenty of food, a bear canister, water filter, knife, tarp, and a flare gun just in case. I double-checked everything twice. I even went to an outdoor store to buy a better compass and a more detailed paper map of the area, just to be safe. I knew there'd be no cell signal out there. That was the point. I drove out early on a Tuesday morning. The highway was empty, and the further I got from the city, the more relaxed I felt. I took a winding forest road off Highway 160 that narrowed until it was barely a trail, leading deeper into the woods. I parked at a small gravel pull-off surrounded by trees. From there, it was about a 4-mile hike to the clearing I'd found on the map. No signs, no trail markers, just forest. I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders and started walking. The first 2 miles were easy, mostly downhill and shaded by thick pine trees. The air was cooler than I expected, and the smell of the forest was clean and sharp, like pine needles and wet dirt. After a couple of hours, I found the clearing. It was beautiful, maybe half a football field wide, surrounded by tall trees on all sides, with a small stream running along one edge. I checked the ground. It was flat and dry. No old fire pits, no beer cans, no boot prints. It didn't look like anyone had camped there in months. That made me feel good. I wanted it to be just mine for a few days. I set up my tent at the far end of the clearing near a clump of thick trees, not too close to the stream. I unpacked my things slowly, taking my time. I boiled water from the stream and filled my bottles. I stashed my food and toiletries in the bear canister and placed it 50 yards away, uphill from the tent. I didn't plan on cooking anything with a smell that might attract animals. Just freeze-dried meals and energy bars. That first night was peaceful. The air was still, and the forest felt heavy with silence. I laid in my sleeping bag listening to the faint sound of water trickling over rocks and the occasional chirp of a cricket. I slept better than I had in months. The next morning, I explored the area. I didn't have a specific plan, just wanted to walk, look around, and breathe. I followed the stream upstream for about an hour. It bent and twisted through rocks and fallen logs. I saw deer tracks in the mud and a couple of squirrels darting through the brush. I didn't see or hear a single person. It felt like I had been dropped into the middle of nowhere, which was exactly what I needed. When I got back to camp, everything was where I left it. I made coffee, ate a protein bar, and sat with my feet in the stream for a while. The cold water stung at first, but started to feel good after a few minutes. I sat there for a long time, thinking about nothing. That was the best part. There was no pressure to do anything. Later that day, I built a small ring of rocks and made a fire just big enough to warm some soup. I kept it low and contained. It wasn't cold, but I liked the feeling of the fire. I put it out before sunset and checked the area for sparks. I didn't want to be the idiot who started a wildfire. I got into my tent just as it got dark. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. I don't know what exactly woke me. Maybe a sound or a shift in the air, but I was wide awake, listening. At first, I heard nothing but the stream. Then I noticed a soft crunching sound, like something stepping on leaves, off to the side near the edge of the trees. I held my breath, straining to listen. It was definitely footsteps, slow, not like an animal, more deliberate. Then it stopped, just nothing. I waited for a long time. My heart was beating fast, but I told myself it could be anything. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. I didn't open the tent. I didn't want to spook it. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around the area. Nothing seemed disturbed. The bare canister was untouched. I walked around the clearing, checked the soft dirt near the stream for tracks. I didn't see anything that looked like a boot print, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I spent the whole day trying to act normal. Boiled water, made lunch, read a little, walked around, but I was more alert. Every snapping twig made me tense up. That night, I went to bed early. I kept my knife inside my sleeping bag and left the rainfly half open so I could see outside. It was colder that night, and I kept waking up in short bursts. At one point, maybe 3 in the morning, I thought I heard movement again, closer this time, maybe 10 or 15 feet away. I froze, staring through the mesh window. I didn't see anything, but I swear something was out there. The next morning, there were still no tracks, no signs, nothing. By the 3rd day, I was starting to feel paranoid. I was tired, and my thoughts kept looping. What if someone was out there, watching? Why? A hunter? A hiker who got lost? Someone hiding? I kept looking into the trees, expecting to see a shape or movement. I even yelled once, just to break the silence, but it only made me feel stupid. I thought about leaving that afternoon. I almost packed everything up, but then I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. It was probably nothing. I told myself I'd stay one more night and then head back in the morning. Around sunset, I went to check the bare canister and noticed something strange. There were drag marks in the dirt near where I'd left it. Long, shallow scrapes, like something heavy had been pulled through the brush. I walked along the marks about 10 yards into the trees and found nothing. Just disturbed pine needles and bent grass. The bare canister was still where I'd placed it, but the marks didn't make sense. It hadn't rained, and no large animals could have moved it without knocking it over. That was the moment my stomach dropped. I packed everything right then, shoved my gear into my pack as fast as I could, not caring about folding or organizing. I left before it got completely dark. I figured I could hike the 4 miles back to the car with my headlamp. I just wanted to get out. I didn't even eat dinner. The hike back was slow and tense. The forest felt wrong. I kept stopping to listen. At one point, I turned off my headlamp and just stood in the dark, hoping to hear better. That's when I heard the snap of a branch behind me, not more than 20 feet away. I turned and shined the light. Nothing, but the sound was real. I started walking faster. I didn't run, I didn't want to trip, but I was sweating and shaking. I kept glancing behind me. I swear I saw movement once, low to the ground, like someone crouching, but it was just for a second. It took me over 2 hours to reach the car. When I finally saw it, I felt this wave of relief so strong I almost cried. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and sat there with the engine running for a long time. I didn't even start driving for 15 minutes. I drove straight back to town. I didn't stop. I didn't sleep until late the next day. I kept the doors locked and blinds shut. I told a couple of people I cut the trip short because I wasn't feeling well. I never told anyone the full story until now. A week later, I went online and looked up news articles about the area. I didn't find much. Just an old story about a guy who went missing in the same region a few years earlier. Hiker, early 30s, vanished without a trace. The article said searchers found his campsite but no sign of him. They assumed he got lost in the woods. But now I wonder, I haven't been camping alone since. I still go out sometimes with friends or in places where I know other people will be nearby. But I don't go deep into the woods alone anymore. Something about that trip changed the way I see those quiet places. I still love the forest, the smell, the quiet. But I know now that just because you don't see anyone doesn't mean you're alone. And sometimes it's not the animals you need to worry about. I'll never know for sure what was out there. Maybe it was just bad luck. Maybe I imagined more than what was real. But I trust my instincts, and that last night my instincts were screaming. Whatever it was, whoever it was, they weren't trying to scare me. They were watching, waiting, and I'm glad I left when I did. Because I think if I'd stayed one more night, I wouldn't be here to tell you this. I had been planning a solo camping trip for months. I needed a break from people, from screens, from all the noise. I'd taken a few shorter trips before, but this time I wanted to go deeper into the woods, farther from cell service, farther from roads. I found a remote area up in British Columbia, somewhere between Clearwater and Wells Gray. A friend had mentioned the trails out there were quiet even during summer, and that sounded perfect to me. I planned a 4-day trip, enough time to hike in, set up a base, explore around, and hike back out. I packed light but carefully. A small tent, sleeping bag, water filter, bear spray, basic food, a camp stove, a headlamp, spare batteries, and the usual gear. I double-checked everything the night before. I looked at maps, wrote down coordinates, left my plans with a friend. I felt prepared, confident. I drove up from Kamloops early in the morning. The road narrowed as I got closer to the park, then turned to gravel. After an hour or so of bouncing down a Forest Service road, I parked where the trailhead started. There were no other cars. I stepped out, stretched, hoisted my pack on, locked the car, and headed in. The trail was overgrown but manageable. The air smelled like pine and dirt and moss. I didn't see anyone. No hikers, no rangers, no signs of life except for a few distant bird calls and the occasional squirrel crashing through the brush. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in months. After about 5 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a creek. The trees opened up just enough to let the sun in, and I could hear the water trickling nearby. Felt like a good spot. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground, filtered some water from the creek, and ate a cold meal of tuna and crackers. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the temperature followed. I pulled on a fleece, zipped into my sleeping bag, and fell asleep listening to the sound of the creek and wind. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times, once to pee, once from what I thought was a snapping branch, but nothing serious. It's normal for the woods to creak and groan at night. Your ears start picking up everything. A raccoon, a breeze, a pine cone falling. It always sounds bigger than it is when you're lying in a tent in the dark. The next morning, I boiled some water for instant coffee and oatmeal. After eating, I packed a small day bag and set out to explore the area. There was no trail, just me walking between trees, trying to follow the contour of the land. I marked my route with bits of orange flagging tape tied to branches. I took photos of landmarks too. Fallen logs, rock piles, forked trees, just to be safe. Around midday, I found a small hill that offered a view of the surrounding forest. Trees stretched out in every direction, and I didn't see any signs of roads or houses. No smoke, no towers, nothing. Just green, brown, and blue. I sat for a while, ate a protein bar, drank water, and turned back. On the way back, I started noticing something strange. The flagging tape I'd tied wasn't where I expected it to be. At first, I thought I'd missed it, but then I saw one lying on the ground. It hadn't blown off, it looked cut, clean across. Another was missing entirely. I still had the photos on my phone, and I used them to reorient myself. It took longer than I'd planned, but I found my way back to camp just before sunset. I told myself the tape had just come loose. Maybe a bird pulled one down. I didn't dwell on it. That night, I heard footsteps, not animal sounds, not scurrying or fluttering or crashing through leaves. These were steady, deliberate, crunching the forest floor slowly, moving in a circle around my tent. I held my breath and listened. The steps paused now and then continued. I grabbed my bear spray and unzipped my sleeping bag slowly. The footsteps stopped. I didn't move. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. Eventually, nothing. No more sound. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching the can of bear spray and staring at the tent walls. When the light came, I stepped outside and looked around. I didn't see anything at first, but then I noticed a few faint marks in the dirt. Deep imprints, like someone had stood in one spot for a while. My tracks from yesterday were nearby, so it was hard to tell. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was a deer. Maybe I was tired. That's what I told myself. I made coffee and walked around the campsite again. Nothing was missing. Nothing disturbed. No broken branches, no litter, no smells. Just the usual forest smells. Pine, damp earth, morning air. I stayed close to camp that day, collected more water, cleaned up my cooking gear, gathered some dry twigs for a small fire later. I didn't go far. That night, it happened again. The same footsteps, a little earlier this time. I was lying in my bag, not asleep yet. I heard them coming from the west. Not fast, not aggressive. Just walking, stopping, moving again. They circled the tent once, twice, then stopped right behind my head. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I could hear breathing, not loud but close. I held my breath, hand on the bear spray. Then silence. No steps walking away. No sound at all. Just silence. Like the whole forest held its breath too. I waited. I couldn't stay in the tent. If something was out there, it knew where I was. I reached slowly for my headlamp, clipped it on, and clicked it to red light mode. I unzipped the door just enough to peek out. Nothing. I stuck my head out. Still nothing. I stepped out, spray in hand, light scanning the woods. I saw trees, shadows, and my own breath. Then I saw something. A tree about 20 feet from my tent had a mark on it that hadn't been there yesterday. A wide, flat spot near the base, rubbed clean of moss and bark. It looked fresh. I walked closer. On the ground next to it was a footprint. A boot print. Not mine. Bigger than mine. I looked around, heart pounding. No other prints. No sign of anyone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up in the tent with my light off and waited for dawn. Every little noise made me twitch. Every gust of wind made me check the tent zipper. By the time the sun came up, I'd made up my mind. I was done. I packed everything in 15 minutes. Tent, bag, stove, shoved it all into my pack. I stuffed trash into a zip bag and buried it. I took one last look around and started hiking out. I moved fast. Too fast, really. My legs burned from the pace. I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't stop for breaks. I barely drank water. About halfway out, I saw something that stopped me cold. A cigarette, but crushed into the dirt next to the trail. Still looked fresh. The filter wasn't soaked from rain or dew. Someone else had been out here. Someone who didn't seem to care about keeping the woods clean. That bothered me more than it should have. I kept going. Another mile, then another. I reached the car just as the sun started dropping again. It was still there, untouched. I unlocked it, threw my pack in, and got in. My hands shook as I started the engine. The gravel road bounced me around, but I didn't slow down. I didn't relax until I hit pavement. Back in Kamloops, I checked into a motel. The hot shower felt unreal. I lay on the bed in a towel, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what happened. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't spoken to anyone, but someone had been out there, watching me, walking around my tent at night, cutting my markers, leaving boot prints. That was no accident. That was on purpose. I thought about reporting it, but what would I say? That someone walked near my tent? That I saw a footprint? That a cigarette but scared me? It sounded paranoid. I deleted the GPS coordinates from my phone. I erased the photos. I didn't want to look at them anymore. I haven't been camping since. Not alone, anyway. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I hear stories about hikers going missing or strange things found deep in the woods. I never saw a face, never heard a voice, but someone was there. They didn't take anything. They didn't hurt me, but they let me know they were out there. That was enough, and I got out. That's what matters. I got out. I was 31 when I decided to take a week off and disappear into the woods. I'd been working 12-hour days at a job that never seemed to stop needing me, and my brain felt like it had been soaked in concrete. I didn't want to go anywhere fancy. I just wanted to be away from everyone. No phones, no voices, no cars. Just me, trees, and quiet. I picked a spot up in northern Maine, not far from the border. A place I found online where you could park your car at a trailhead and then hike about 4 miles in to reach a clearing by a small lake. No cabins, no other campsites nearby, no services. Just open space, woods, and water. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear carefully over 2 days. I made sure I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, stove, fuel, food, first aid kit, water filter, extra batteries, knife, and all the basics. I even packed a small emergency radio and a flare gun just in case. I left my itinerary with my sister back in Portland and told her not to worry unless she hadn't heard from me by the following Sunday. I left early Tuesday morning and made it to the trailhead by around 11. The hike in was steady but peaceful. The trees were thick and healthy. Every now and then I'd spot a squirrel or hear a woodpecker. The trail was clear but not overly worn, which told me not many people came this way. That was exactly what I was hoping for. The deeper I went, the better I felt. It was like breathing clean air for the first time in months. When I reached the lake, it was just as described, maybe even better. The water was still and dark and surrounded by tall pine trees. A narrow strip of flat land opened on the east side where I set up my tent, maybe 20 feet from the water's edge. The first night was almost perfect. I cooked rice and beans on the stove, sat on a folding stool by the fire pit, and watched the sun go down behind the trees on the other side of the lake. There was no wind, no bugs, no noise except for the occasional frog or bird. I stayed up until it got cold, then crawled into my sleeping bag and passed out fast. The next morning, I woke up to light tapping on the roof of the tent. It had started to rain. Not heavy, just enough to keep the air wet. I stayed in the tent a little longer than planned, reading a paperback I'd brought along and listening to the sound of rain on nylon. By noon, the rain let up and I stepped out, stretched, and went down to the lake to fill up my water bottles. That's when I noticed boot prints on the edge of the lake. They weren't mine. They were fresh. I could tell because the mud still held their shape with clear treads. I hadn't walked that far down the shoreline, and my boots had a different pattern. These were deeper, wider, probably someone heavier than me. I stood there for a second, confused. I hadn't seen or heard anyone yesterday, and I didn't remember passing anyone on the way in. Still, it wasn't impossible that someone else had come in from a different route. Maybe a hunter or another camper, but something about them made my stomach feel tight. I looked around and didn't see anyone. The woods were still. The lake was quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had made those prints hadn't wanted to be seen. I spent the rest of the day trying to brush it off. I went fishing with a collapsible rod I'd brought. Caught nothing, but it gave me something to focus on. Still, every now and then I'd glance back toward the woods, feeling watched. I didn't see or hear anything out of place, but I kept my bear spray on my hip and checked the perimeter of my camp before dark. Nothing. That night I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, thinking I heard things. Small cracks, faint rustling, probably just raccoons or wind. But each time I opened my eyes, I had that same tight feeling in my chest, like something was off. Just before dawn, I sat up, zipped open the tent, and scanned the clearing. My heart jumped. Something had been dragged through the dirt by the fire pit. I couldn't tell what, maybe a stick or gear. The marks were uneven and had little ridges on the side, like something with rope or fabric had been pulled. I checked all my stuff. Everything was still there, but the tracks didn't make sense. I didn't leave anything out overnight except the fire grate, and that was still in place. I couldn't figure out what had been moved, but the fact that something had been moved and I didn't hear it made my nerves buzz. I decided to keep my eyes open and make sure nothing was missing the next day. I also started marking little things around the camp to see if they changed. I laid 2 sticks in an X near the path to the lake. I balanced a thin rock on top of another one near my tent entrance. Just small things that would show me if someone had walked through or messed with my space. That afternoon, I hiked up a ridge to the west of the lake. It gave me a view of the whole area, and I stayed there for maybe an hour just watching. No sign of movement, no campfires, no voices, nothing. When I got back to my site, one of the sticks was out of place. The X was broken. The rock was still there, though. I checked the rest of my gear. Again, nothing was missing, but someone had definitely come by. The next morning, I found a cigarette, but in the dirt near the trail I'd come in on. I don't smoke. It wasn't there before. That was the first time I actually felt scared. Someone was definitely around, close, watching me, and they weren't trying to say hello or make themselves known. They were just observing, keeping their distance, and messing with things when I wasn't looking. That's what made it worse. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was quiet, subtle, and intentional. I made a decision right then to leave a day early. I packed everything up quickly and kept looking over my shoulder. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even as I walked away, the forest felt heavier, like the air itself was watching me. I didn't stop to eat, just kept walking as fast as I could without running. It took me just under 2 hours to reach the trailhead. When I got to the car, the driver's side door was unlocked. I knew I had locked it. I'm obsessive about that kind of thing. The glove compartment had been opened, and my registration was sitting on the passenger seat. Nothing else was taken. Not the emergency cash, not the spare key, just the paperwork moved out and placed where I'd see it. I checked under the car, checked the tires. Everything seemed fine, but I still drove out as fast as I could. I only stopped once to get gas near Bangor, and I didn't breathe easy until I got back home. The next day, I went through my gear just to double-check everything. That's when I noticed my flashlight was missing. Not the headlamp I wore, but the small tactical flashlight I kept in the outer pocket of my backpack. It was gone. I hadn't even noticed. I never took it out. It wasn't valuable, but it was the only thing missing. Whoever had been watching me hadn't just messed with the camp or the car. They had taken something personal, something small, something I might not notice right away. That scared me more than anything else. I reported it to the local ranger station, but there wasn't much they could do. No signs of assault or theft, technically, just weird disturbances. The ranger I spoke with said there had been reports before. People coming back from that part of the woods feeling unsettled, like someone had been near them but never showing themselves. A few stories of gear being moved or small items disappearing. No arrests, no suspects, just stories. I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. The outdoors didn't feel the same. I kept imagining someone sitting in the dark, just outside the ring of light from the campfire, waiting, not doing anything, just watching. That's what stuck with me, the silence, the patience. Whoever it was, they didn't want to be found. They wanted to watch without being seen, and that somehow was worse than anything else. Eventually, I started hiking again, day trips only. I kept to busy trails. I bought a better GPS, new locks for my car, and never left anything unattended. But I never went back to that lake. I never even looked at it on a map. There are places where people go to be alone, and sometimes someone else is already there. Not always loud, not always obvious. Sometimes they're just there, quiet, careful, waiting for someone like me to come along and think they're truly alone. And that's the part one never forgot, because I wasn't. It was the second week of October in 2017 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip to clear my head. I had just gone through a rough breakup and needed to step away from everything. I was living in Ohio at the time, and I remembered this remote area near Wayne National Forest that I had visited once during a geology field trip in college. It wasn't an official campsite, but there was an old logging trail that wound down into a valley, quiet and mostly untouched, where people occasionally set up for a night. I figured it would be perfect. No crowds, no cars, no distractions. I packed light but made sure to bring the essentials. A small tent, a sleeping bag, my camp stove, a water filtration system, freeze-dried meals, a map of the area, a knife, and my small but reliable hiking backpack. I also had my old metal flashlight, some spare batteries, and a power bank for my phone, though I didn't expect to get any signal out there. The plan was simple. Hike in about 4 or 5 miles, set up camp, stay 2 nights, then head back. I arrived at the trailhead around 9:30 in the morning. The sky was mostly overcast with that thick, gray autumn cloud cover that makes the forest feel even quieter than usual. The air was cool and smelled of wet leaves, dirt, and moss. There was nobody around. I parked the car just off the shoulder of the access road, locked it, and started hiking in. The trail had grown narrow since the last time I was there. Thick brush lined both sides, and fallen leaves covered everything. making it hard to tell how often people used it. After about an hour and a half of steady hiking, I came to a small clearing tucked in the valley, maybe 30 yards wide. One side opened toward a shallow creek that ran over smooth rocks. The sound of the water and the surrounding trees made it feel completely cut off from everything. I decided to set up camp near the edge of the creek, under a pair of tall oaks. By early afternoon, I had my tent pitched and my gear laid out. I boiled some water for one of the freeze-dried meals, beef stew, and sat on a flat rock while I ate, listening to the water. The isolation was already starting to settle in. I didn't mind it at first. I hadn't seen another person all day, and that was part of what I had come for. The first night went by uneventfully. The temperature dropped fast after sunset, and I layered up before crawling into my sleeping bag. It got dark quickly, almost too quickly, and I was reminded how unforgiving the woods could feel without artificial light. I kept my flashlight by my side but didn't need it much. I listened to the usual forest sounds: branches creaking, the wind moving through leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. It wasn't until around 3 a.m. that I heard something strange. What sounded like a distant thud followed by the crunch of leaves. It wasn't an animal sound. It had weight to it, like a footstep, maybe a deer. I told myself it was just wildlife and pulled the sleeping bag tighter. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling stiff but rested. The sun was already creeping through the trees. I made coffee, filtered water from the creek, and took a short hike around the area without my pack. I didn't see any signs of other campers. No old fire pits, no trash, no boot prints. I went back to camp, had another meal, and spent most of the afternoon reading a paperback I had brought. Everything felt peaceful again, at least until the sun started going down. It was a little after 6 when I noticed something that put me on edge. I had gone to collect more water before it got dark, and when I came back to my tent, the zipper on one side was halfway down. I was sure I had left it fully zipped. It was a habit I always kept, mostly to keep bugs out. I checked inside the tent, and nothing seemed disturbed. My sleeping bag was still rolled up, and my gear was untouched. But it bothered me. I looked around the campsite, checked for prints, broken twigs, anything. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I stayed up later than the first. I kept the flashlight on low and read in the tent for a while. The noises outside were different. Less wind, more intermittent crunching, like something walking slowly across the leaf-covered ground. Once or twice, I turned off the flashlight and listened. The sounds would stop for a while, then start again. They were faint but not far off, maybe 50 or 60 feet away. I considered the possibility of a bear or a coyote, but the steps didn't sound like that. They were too spaced out, too deliberate. Sometime after midnight, I finally lay down, though I didn't sleep much. I kept waking up, heart racing at every little sound. Around 2:40 a.m., I heard something that made my skin crawl. 2 short metallic clicks, like the sound of something brushing or tapping against metal. I sat up slowly, listening as hard as I could. My tent has a small mesh window near the top, so I unzipped it just enough to peek out. I couldn't see anything through the trees, just faint outlines in the dark. The noise didn't come again. Eventually, I forced myself to lay back down and just waited for morning. By dawn, I had made up my mind to leave. I hadn't come for thrills or a survival challenge. I came to clear my head, not to feel like I was being watched. I packed up quickly, skipping breakfast, and just stuffed everything into my pack without much care for how organized it was. As I was getting ready to leave, I did a quick once-over of the area one last time. That's when I found something that nearly made me drop my pack. About 30 feet behind where I had set up camp, partially hidden under a brush pile, was a pair of fresh boot prints in the soft mud. They weren't mine. The tread was different, and they were larger than my boots. They looked new. No leaves covering them, no signs of rain erosion. Just 2 clear prints facing directly toward where my tent had been. I didn't stop to study them long. I adjusted my pack and started back toward the trail. I moved faster than I had on the way in. I kept checking behind me every few minutes. The whole forest felt different now. Every branch snap, every gust of wind made me flinch. About a mile from the trailhead, I saw something off the trail that I hadn't noticed before. A tree had been marked, 3 slashes into the bark at shoulder height. Not animal scratches, straight lines, deliberate. I didn't stop walking. When I reached my car, everything looked normal, but I checked all the doors and under the vehicle anyway. I got in, locked the doors immediately, and drove straight out of there without stopping until I hit the main road again. For a while, I told myself it was probably just another hiker passing through. Maybe someone out hunting early in the morning. Maybe they saw my camp and stayed quiet not to disturb me. But the more I thought about it, the less that made sense. Who hikes out to a remote part of a national forest, walks around a stranger's tent in the middle of the night, and doesn't say anything? Why tap on metal? Why leave no trace except for those prints? When I got home, I unpacked and checked my gear again. Everything seemed fine. But 3 days later, I noticed something strange. My knife, the one I had packed in the side pocket of my bag, was gone. I knew I hadn't used it during the trip, and I never took it out. It was just gone. The pocket wasn't damaged or unzipped. It was like someone had reached in and quietly taken it while I slept. That was the part that really stuck with me. The idea that someone had been close enough to take something without waking me up. That they stood there, watching long enough to see where I kept it. I've camped dozens of times before and since, but I've never gone back to that part of the forest. And I've never camped alone again. I didn't report it. There was nothing to report, really. Just a feeling, a few prints, a missing knife. It wasn't until months later, in early spring, that I found a thread on a local forum. People talking about strange encounters in that same general area. One person mentioned hearing noises at night. Another found strange markings on trees. One said they saw a man in camouflage gear watching from a ridge before disappearing into the trees. There were no attacks, no crimes, just odd, unsettling moments that matched the same area and vibe I experienced. I didn't reply to the thread. I didn't want to relive it too much, but I read every post. And in every single one, people said the same thing. They felt like they were being watched. That whoever or whatever it was, they never heard it approach. They only noticed after something had already happened. Like it wanted them to know they had been seen, but only after it was already gone. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was something far more real. Person. Maybe someone living off-grid. Or maybe just someone who enjoys scaring people. That's what stayed with me the most. The idea that a stranger could be out there, deep in the woods, watching without you ever knowing, until they choose to let you know. I went out there to be alone, and I think that's exactly what someone else was counting on. The sun was just beginning to sink behind the hills when I finally found the spot. I had been driving all day, searching for a quiet place to camp alone for the weekend. My plan was simple. Get away from the city noise, set up my tent, spend a few days hiking and reading, and just clear my head. No phone, no internet, just me and the woods. I turned off the dirt road onto a narrow path that led deeper into the forest. The tires crunched over dry leaves and small branches as I drove. The trees were thick here, tall pines and oaks that blocked much of the fading light. I spotted a small clearing about the size of a backyard, enough for my tent and a small fire ring. It looked untouched, like nobody had been here in a while. Perfect. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing and stepped out. The air smelled fresh but slightly damp, the way it does after a light rain. I pulled my backpack out of the trunk, feeling the weight of my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and some basic supplies. Nothing fancy. I wanted this trip to be simple. Setting up the tent took longer than I expected. The poles were stiff, and the ground was harder than I thought. I had to clear some rocks and roots before I could stake it down properly. By the time I finished, the sky was almost dark. The last bits of orange and pink vanished behind the thick canopy. I started a small fire in the ring I found, gathering dry twigs and pine needles. The crackling flames gave me a small sense of comfort in the growing dark. I heated some canned soup over the fire and ate quietly, listening to the sounds around me. The rustling of leaves in the wind, distant bird calls settling down for the night, the faint hum of insects. I felt calm, almost peaceful. I lay back against a fallen log, watching the stars begin to appear through the gaps in the trees. The air was cool, with a slight breeze that made the fire flicker. It was exactly what I wanted. No distractions, no people. As the night deepened, the forest grew silent in a way that felt heavy. The usual night sounds, crickets, frogs, seemed distant or muted. I shrugged it off as my imagination. Maybe the area was just quiet. I finished my fire and put out the flames carefully, making sure nothing was left to smolder. I zipped up inside my tent and lay on my sleeping pad. The nylon walls felt thin, barely enough to keep out the chill. The forest outside seemed so close. I could hear every snap of a twig, every soft thud of something moving over the leaves. Sleep didn't come easily. I turned over a few times, listening. Then I heard it, a faint sound like footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the footsteps didn't move like that. They were slow, careful, deliberate. Something was walking just outside my tent. I held my breath, staring at the tent wall, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard a low, dragging noise. Something heavy was being pulled over the dirt. My heart started to pound. I grabbed the small flashlight I kept in my pack and clicked it on. Outside the tent, just a few feet away, the beam caught the outline of something dark. It was hard to see clearly, but I could make out a shape roughly human-sized. I wanted to call out or move, but I stayed still, frozen. Then the footsteps moved away slowly, disappearing into the woods. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. The quiet returned, heavier than before. I told myself it was probably a hunter or someone else camping nearby, maybe looking for firewood. But the dragging sound and the way the footsteps moved didn't feel right. Morning came slowly, the sun filtering weakly through the trees. I packed up quickly, eager to leave. But when I walked over the clearing, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the ground near the fire ring were deep marks, like heavy boots had pressed and scraped the earth. They formed a path leading into the woods, and beside them was a long strip of torn fabric, dark and muddy. I didn't want to think about it, but I knew. Someone had been here last night, close enough to watch me. I decided to hike back the way I came instead of driving. I didn't want to get caught on the dirt road if whoever had been here was still around. The forest felt different on the trail. The light was better, but the trees seemed to close in. Every noise made me jump. A snapping branch, a rustling bush. I kept looking over my shoulder. After a couple of hours, I reached a small ranger station near the main road. It was closed for the season, but there was a phone booth outside. I called the local sheriff's office and told them what I had seen. The footprints, the dragging sound, the torn fabric. They said they would send someone to check it out. While I waited, I noticed some fresh tire tracks nearby, muddy and deep, not from my car. Someone had been driving around here, maybe following me. Later that day, a ranger arrived with a couple of deputies. They took my statement and searched the area. They found a makeshift campsite about a mile down the trail, hidden under thick bushes. The fire pit was old, but there were fresh scraps of food and empty cans scattered around. They told me the area had a history of some trespassers, people living rough in the woods, sometimes hunters, sometimes worse. But nothing dangerous had been reported recently. Still, they warned me to be careful. The woods can be unpredictable, and some people who live outside the law do use places like this. I left the forest that afternoon feeling uneasy but relieved. I realized that the wilderness isn't just peaceful trees and fresh air. There are real dangers out there. People who don't want to be found, who might be watching you without you knowing. I didn't come back to that spot again, and I don't plan to. But the experience taught me something important about being alone in the wild. You never really know what's out there. Sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts but people, and the quiet can hide more than just animals. Since that trip, I've taken extra precautions. I always tell someone where I'm going, carry a GPS, and avoid camping too far off the beaten path. The woods can be beautiful, yes, but they can also be dangerous in ways you don't expect. Looking back, I'm glad I stayed calm that night. I didn't confront whoever was there. but I stayed safe. Sometimes that's all you can do. Keep your head down, move quietly, and get out. The forest is still out there, wild and free, but now I respect it in a different way. It's not just a place to escape to. It's a place where you have to be careful, where you have to watch your back, because not everything that hides in the shadows wants to be found. I decided to go camping alone in early November, which was probably my first mistake. I'd been needing a break from everything: people, noise, stress. So I figured a few days out in the woods by myself would help clear my head. I chose a quiet spot near Shaw Creek in southern Oregon, about an hour and a half from where I lived. It wasn't a campground, just a patch of wilderness I found on an old hiking blog, with no marked trails or campsites, which was what I wanted. No people, no distractions, just forest, sky, and the sound of running water. The weather was colder than I expected when I arrived, just before sunset. I'd packed for it: good sleeping bag, wool socks, layers, but the chill still bit through my jacket as I parked my truck at the end of a rough logging road and started hiking into the woods. The walk to the creek took about 45 minutes. The ground was covered in damp leaves, mostly brown now, and the forest was quiet. Too quiet, actually. I didn't hear any birds or insects, just the occasional creak of a tree in the wind or the rustle of leaves when I stepped through them. By the time I reached the creek, the light was almost gone. I picked a flat area about 10 yards from the water, under a small stand of fir trees, and set up my tent by the light of my headlamp. The air smelled clean, cold, and a little earthy. Once the tent was up, I made a quick dinner. Some canned chili warmed on a small propane stove, and sat near the fire I built with sticks and some old branches I dragged over from a fallen tree nearby. Felt peaceful at first. I sat there for maybe 2 hours, staring at the fire, listening to the water, and just letting my brain slow down. But as the fire died down and I got ready to crawl into my tent, I noticed something that felt a little off. It wasn't anything obvious, no movement, no sounds, but just a feeling. That uncomfortable sense that you're being watched, even though you know there's nobody around. I chalked it up to being alone in the dark and too used to city noise. Still, I kept the hatchet I brought with me right next to my sleeping bag, just in case. The first night passed without anything strange happening. I woke up a few times because it was cold and my back was sore from the uneven ground, but nothing really bothered me. In the morning, I boiled water for instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and walked upstream for a couple of miles, just exploring. The forest was still dead quiet. I didn't see any animals or tracks, which was weird, especially near a creek. I did see what looked like old boot prints in some of the muddy banks, but they could have been from anyone, hunters, hikers, or campers from earlier in the season. By late afternoon, I came back, made a fire again, and cooked a pack of ramen noodles. I sat on a log I'd dragged over and watched the smoke curl into the sky. As the sun dropped lower, the shadows grew long and sharp, and that same weird feeling returned. It wasn't fear exactly, more like tension, like my body was on edge for no clear reason. I kept scanning the trees behind my tent, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing, just woods and cold air and wind brushing through the leaves. That night was when things started to get worse. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a noise that I couldn't explain. It wasn't an animal sound. It was more like a thud, not loud but solid, like someone had stepped on a log or dropped something heavy onto the forest floor. I stayed still in my sleeping bag, not moving, holding my breath, listening. The creek still rushed steadily nearby, but under that, I heard faint crunching. Slow, careful footsteps, not a deer crashing through brush. These were quieter, measured, deliberate. I reached for my hatchet and held it against my chest. The footsteps moved slowly around my tent, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I didn't have any lights on, and my fire had burned out completely. I couldn't see a thing through the nylon walls. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but something told me not to. I just stayed frozen, ears straining, heart pounding so loud it was hard to hear anything else. Then the footsteps stopped. I lay there for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only 5 minutes. I didn't hear anything else. No footsteps, no twigs snapping. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been an animal, maybe a bear or coyote, and that it wandered off. But I barely slept after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something again, even though it might have just been the wind. In the morning, I walked the area around my tent. I didn't see any tracks at first, but about 15 feet away, I found a partial print in the mud. A shoe print. Not a hiking boot either, it looked more like a worn-out sneaker. It was hard to tell the size, but it wasn't mine. I hadn't walked around that side of the tent the day before. That was enough to convince me someone had actually been out there. I packed everything up by noon and hiked back to my truck, deciding I'd camp somewhere else or just go home. But when I got to the spot where I'd parked, my stomach dropped. The truck was there, but something had been messed with. At first glance, it looked fine, but when I got closer, I saw that the driver's side door was slightly cracked open. Not wide, but just enough that it wasn't latched all the way. I was 100% sure I'd locked it. I always do. I checked the glove box, nothing missing. The ignition was untouched, and the tires were fine. But the inside felt wrong. The seat was pushed back a little more than I remembered, and there were small bits of dirt on the floor mat that hadn't been there before. I slammed the door shut and locked it again. I stood there for a long time trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to drive straight to the nearest ranger station or sheriff's office, but there was nothing they could really do. No damage, nothing stolen, and no proof of anything. So I just drove home, feeling like something had crossed a line I couldn't explain. The weirdest part was what I found when I unpacked my bag that night. Everything was in place. My stove, my food, my clothes, but one thing was different. My flashlight, the smaller one I kept in the side pouch, had been switched out. The one in my bag wasn't mine. Same model, same size, but it had a crack in the lens that mine didn't have. And the batteries were gone. Just empty, like someone had swapped theirs for mine while I was sleeping. That was when I realized it hadn't just been a hiker or some random person passing through. Whoever it was had come into my camp, circled my tent, and probably went through my stuff while I was asleep. They didn't take anything big, just switched one item. That made it worse somehow. It wasn't theft. It was a message, like they wanted me to know they'd been there. I didn't go to the woods alone after that. In fact, I didn't camp again at all for almost a year. I told myself it was just some drifter or weirdo, maybe living off the grid, who stumbled onto my camp and got curious. But deep down, I don't believe that. Someone had watched me, moved quietly, waited until I was asleep, and they didn't try to hurt me, but they wanted me to know they could have. A few months later, out of curiosity, I checked the blog where I'd first read about that area. The post was gone. I found another entry by the same person, but it had been updated with a warning not to camp near Shaw Creek anymore. It didn't say why, just a vague note about increased off-grid activity and personal safety concerns. That pretty much confirmed what I already felt. I wasn't alone out there. Someone was living nearby. Someone who didn't want visitors. Someone who didn't mind creeping through the trees at night and quietly stepping into your space just enough to rattle you. Just enough to make you question if they'd ever really left at all. I've been camping again since then, but only in public sites and never alone. I still love the outdoors, but I carry more gear now. Motion sensors, extra lights, trail cams, and I never camp in the same place twice. Once you've felt someone moving outside your tent in the dark, just out of sight, you don't forget it. You don't stop listening, and you never fully sleep through the night. It was mid-September when I decided to take a few days off work and go camping by myself. I had some unused vacation days, and I was feeling burned out, tired of traffic, screens, and the constant noise around me. I wanted silence, not just the quiet you get in your room with the door closed, but the kind of silence you can only find deep in nature, where there are no people around for miles. I didn't tell many people I was going. I let my brother know where I'd be and gave him a rough idea of how long I'd be out there, just in case, but that was it. I wanted to be alone. I picked a remote area in northern Idaho, not far from the Montana border. The place was called Cooper's Ridge. I had found it by scanning satellite maps and backcountry forums. It wasn't an official campground. No bathrooms, no marked trails. Just a clearing near a small stream about 7 miles off a service road that itself was already pretty far off the main highway. I parked my truck where the dirt road ended, packed up my gear, and started walking into the forest. The hike in was peaceful, quiet like I wanted, pine trees thick all around, and the ground was soft with dry needles. My pack was heavy with food, water, and gear, but I'd done enough camping to be used to it. After 2 hours or so, I reached the clearing and set up camp. I had a small 2-person tent, a bare canister for food, a hatchet, my stove, and a few other essentials. I boiled some water, made freeze-dried beef stew, and sat on a log by the fire ring I built out of stones. It was warm during the day, but the wind picked up at night, and the temperature dropped fast. I added more layers, stoked the fire, and watched the shadows get longer. The first night was normal. I fell asleep to the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional rustle in the brush. Small animals, I figured. I was up before dawn the next day and made oatmeal with coffee, then walked a couple of miles downstream just exploring. I saw no one. No trails, no rappers, no sign anyone had camped there in years. Exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent most of the day collecting firewood, reading, and sharpening my knife on a flat stone. The silence was thick, but not eerie, just heavy. I slept again that night without any trouble, except for waking up once around 2 a.m. to pee. It was cold enough that my breath came out in white puffs, and the sky was so clear you could see every star. No wind, no sounds. It was the third day that things started to feel off. I woke up around 7, stretched, and stepped outside my tent. I always put my boots inside the vestibule at night, but that morning one of them was lying 5 feet from the tent, sideways in the dirt. At first I thought maybe I had accidentally kicked it when I came back from peeing in the night, but I always double-check everything before sleeping. I didn't remember hearing anything either. I looked around, checked my gear, made sure nothing was missing or moved. Everything else was fine. The boot wasn't even damaged, just dirty. Still, it bothered me. I brushed it off, but I kept thinking about it all morning. I went down to the stream again, filled up my bottles with the filter, and sat by the water trying to relax. But my mind kept going back to the boot. It was such a small thing, but I couldn't let it go. Something about it didn't feel right. When I got back to camp, I scanned the area more carefully. I looked for tracks, but didn't see anything fresh, just the ones I had left myself. Still, the pine needles could cover up prints easily. That night, I didn't sleep as easily. I had a fire going longer than usual, even though I was trying to conserve wood. I kept my knife closer to my sleeping bag, and I double-checked everything before getting inside the tent. The wind picked up again around midnight, and I lay awake for a long time, listening. Every little sound seemed sharper, sticks cracking, leaves moving. I told myself it was probably just deer or raccoons. I finally drifted off sometime around 2 a.m. I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. Not loud, but too deliberate, like something being dragged slowly over dirt and leaves. My heart started pounding right away. I stayed completely still and listened. It stopped after maybe 10 seconds, then started again, slower this time. Came from behind the tent, maybe 20 feet away. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just waited. Then it stopped completely. I lay there in the dark for what felt like an hour, not even blinking. Eventually, I fell asleep again out of sheer exhaustion. When I got up that morning, I went straight behind the tent to look. Nothing. No prints, no signs of anything dragged, no broken branches. I checked the food canister, which I had latched and stored about 30 feet away from camp. It hadn't been touched. I told myself maybe it was the wind playing tricks. Maybe a branch fell and dragged on the ground. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been there. I spent the whole day uneasy. I kept checking over my shoulder, circling the camp, and not going far. I barely ate. I didn't go to the stream. I was on edge from the moment I woke up to the moment the sun went down. When it started getting dark, I built up the fire bigger than usual and sat with my back to a tree. I didn't want anything behind me. I kept the hatchet next to me on the ground, blade exposed. The fire cracked and popped, and I stared at it for hours. I didn't go inside the tent until I physically couldn't keep my eyes open. That night, I woke up again. Same sound, slow dragging, but this time it was closer, maybe 10 feet. My heart was beating so hard it felt like it was shaking the sleeping bag. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't move, just listened. Then I heard another sound, faint, but distinct. A low, soft shuffle of footsteps. Not an animal, not four-legged. Two. It moved around the tent slowly, crunching leaves as it walked. Then silence. I stayed frozen for hours. I only started to move when the sky began to turn pale gray. I waited until it was fully light before I unzipped the tent. Again, nothing. No prints, no marks. But I noticed the pile of kindling I'd left next to the fire pit had been scattered. Sticks spread all over like someone had kicked them. I packed my bag in under 10 minutes and decided I was leaving that morning. I didn't even eat. I just drank water, grabbed my gear, and started walking fast. But something felt wrong. The path out, the one I had followed in, felt different. I had marked some trees with little cuts to keep track of direction, and some of those cuts looked fresh, like they had been made recently. But others were missing entirely. I couldn't explain it. I started to second-guess every step. After a while, I stopped seeing any of my markers. The trees were starting to look too similar. My stomach sank. I told myself to stay calm. I had a compass and I remembered the direction of the dirt road. But still, it didn't feel right. After another hour of walking, I realized I was off track. I sat down, drank more water, and studied the map. I reoriented myself and started again. But I kept catching strange things in the corners of my eyes. Quick movements, like something ducking behind a tree. Every time I turned my head, there was nothing. No birds, no animals. The forest was dead silent. By midday, I was drenched in sweat even though it wasn't hot. I hadn't eaten. I didn't want to stop moving. I kept going until my legs were sore and my shoulders were burning. Then I heard a branch snap. Not close, maybe 100 feet off, but loud. I froze and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. I kept walking. It happened again 20 minutes later. Another snap. Same distance. Still nothing. I started to think someone was following me. Staying just out of sight, stepping only when I moved. I tested it. I stood still for 10 minutes, barely breathing. Nothing. Then I took a step. A pause. Then two more. Then I stopped again. That's when I heard it. A single crunch behind me off to the left. I didn't turn around. I started walking faster. Not running, just steady and fast. I didn't want to show panic. I knew panic would kill my sense of direction. I pushed through brush, scraped my arms, tore my pants, but I kept going. Eventually, I heard the faint sound of running water. A creek. I didn't recognize it, but I followed it anyway. Water meant I could reorient. I followed it downstream, and after about a mile, I saw something that nearly made me cry. A faded tire track in the dirt near a broken hunting blind. I followed the track, and after another hour of walking, I found the dirt road. I didn't stop. I walked another mile down that road, and when I saw my truck, I felt like collapsing. Everything was still there. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine without even sitting down to rest. I didn't see anyone as I drove back toward the highway. No cars, no people. That was 3 years ago. I haven't gone solo camping since. I still hike. I still love the woods, but I stay on marked trails now. I stick to areas with cell service and other campers nearby. I'll never forget the way it felt to be watched out there, not by an animal. The late afternoon sun was beginning its slow descent behind the thick pine trees when I finally reached the edge of the forest where I had planned to camp. I had been driving all day, alone, seeking a place far from noise, people, and the tangled demands of the city. This patch of wilderness was supposed to be quiet, a simple spot to set up my tent, light a fire, and spend a night in peace before heading back home the next day. The forest was dense here, tall pines standing straight and close together, their trunks thick with rough bark and their needles whispering with the gentle wind. The The air smelled fresh, crisp with the scent of earth and pine resin. I pulled my backpack off the car seat, feeling its weight and the familiar comfort of my gear inside. Sleeping bag, stove, water, food, matches, and the little first aid kit I always carried. I'd been camping a handful of times before, but this time I wanted to go deeper into nature on my own terms. I picked a spot near a small clearing, where the ground was soft with moss and dry needles, perfect for pitching my tent. The sun was warm on my back, and a quiet buzz of insects filled the air. I liked the solitude. No one around for miles, just me and the forest. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to arrange everything properly. Setting up the tent was straightforward, the poles sliding into their sleeves and the fabric stretching tight and firm. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, a small shelter from the unknowns outside. The fire pit was my next task. I cleared a circle of ground, pulling away dry leaves and pine needles to prevent the flames from spreading. I gathered sticks and twigs from the forest floor, making a small pile to start the fire. It was peaceful work, the simple act of preparing for the night. When I finally struck the match and the fire caught, the small flames flickered and danced, sending sparks into the cool air. I sat back on a fallen log, letting the warmth wash over me. The forest was alive with subtle sounds, the rustle of branches, the distant call of a bird, the hum of insects. The sun slipped lower, and the shadows grew longer and darker between the trees. I had brought a book, but I didn't open it. Instead, I let my thoughts drift, watching the flames crackle and listening to the night slowly waking. Darkness came quickly once the sun disappeared, and with it, the forest changed. The comforting noises of the day became sharper, more intense. The snapping of a twig here, the rustling of leaves there. I had expected this, knew that the forest was different at night. But now, alone in the dim glow of my fire, I felt a creeping sense of unease. I kept my knife close and my flashlight within reach. My phone had no signal, which was why I liked this place, but also why I needed to be careful. I reminded myself of the basic rules. Don't wander off too far. Keep the fire going. Make noise if anything approaches. But even with all my preparation, the darkness felt like it was swallowing me whole. About an hour after dark, I heard the first distant howl. Not a wolf, I told myself, more like a coyote or some other wild animal. It was far off, but it sent a shiver down my spine. The sound echoed through the trees and disappeared just as quickly as it had come. I stared into the blackness beyond my firelight, trying to spot any movement, but saw only shadows. I ate a little of my food, a sandwich, some nuts, and sipped water from my bottle. I was cold despite the fire, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. My eyes kept darting to the edges of the firelight, alert to every sound. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a heavy thud, like a branch breaking under weight, then another, and then footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching over dry leaves. My heart sped up. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the noise, the beam cutting through the dark. The trees looked the same, still and tall, but the sounds continued, moving closer, circling my camp. I held my breath, listening. Then a soft grunt, and suddenly a large shape appeared at the edge of the light. A deer, a large buck, caught in the glare, frozen and staring at me with wide eyes. Relief flooded me, but the animal didn't run away. Instead, it lingered just beyond the firelight, like it was watching me as much as I was watching it. The silence stretched for minutes, broken only by the crackling fire and my own breathing. Then, as quickly as it had come, the deer bounded away into the darkness. I felt a strange mix of awe and unease. The forest was full of life, but it was a life that didn't pause for humans. I tried to relax, reminded myself that this was all normal, natural. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone in a way that was different from usual. Later, when I decided to put the fire out and crawl into my tent, the forest grew colder, more silent. I zipped up the tent flap and settled inside my sleeping bag. The night outside was still, but I could hear faint noises, the occasional rustle of leaves, the movement of small animals nearby. I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come easily. Around midnight, A sharp noise startled me awake. It was a snapping sound, loud and sudden, like something heavy stepping on a branch right outside the tent. My heart hammered in my chest. I grabbed my flashlight again and unzipped the tent just a little, enough to shine the light outside. There was nothing visible except the swaying trees and the glimmer of stars through the canopy. But the noise had come too close for comfort. I scanned the darkness, shining the light in every direction, but found nothing. Minutes later, the sound came again, this time accompanied by a low grunt. I froze, listening. My mind ran through every possible explanation. Bear, mountain lion, a human? But the low grunt didn't sound like any animal I was familiar with. It was too guttural, too deliberate. The noises circled the camp again, slow and steady. I could hear heavy breathing outside the tent. My breathing matched it, fast and shallow, heart pounding. I held my knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other, ready for whatever might come. Time passed like this, tense and nerve-wracking. Then the noises stopped as suddenly as they had started. The forest fell silent again. I waited, unable to move, until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the trees. When I finally unzipped the tent fully and stepped outside, the world looked peaceful once more. The fire pit was untouched, the clearing empty. But near the edge of the woods, I noticed fresh footprints in the soft earth. Large, heavy prints, not like any animal I recognized. They were human. They came close to the fire pit, circled it, and then disappeared back into the trees. I packed my things quickly, my hands trembling as I broke down the tent. I didn't want to stay another night. The forest had shown me its wild side, not through ghosts or stories, but through something real and terrifying. The presence of someone or something else, close enough to be dangerous, close enough to watch. On the drive back, my mind replayed every sound, every step, every breath I'd heard in the night. I realized that the wilderness is not just a quiet escape. It's home to others, some of whom are unpredictable and silent. I had come seeking solitude but found something much more raw and real. That night taught me to respect the forest for what it is. Not a place for comfort, but a place of survival, where you are just one small part of a larger, often unknowable world. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't what you see, but what you know could be there, watching from just beyond the firelight. I parked my car at the edge of a narrow dirt road that cut into the woods about 30 minutes north of a small town called Belridge. The area wasn't on any official campground list, but I'd heard from a guy at work that people sometimes pitched a tent back here for a weekend, especially if they wanted to avoid crowds. I'd been planning this solo camping trip for over a month, just waiting for a weekend where the weather lined up and I didn't have anything else going on. I needed a break from work, from noise, from people. Just a few quiet days in the forest. That's all I wanted. It was early Friday afternoon. The sky was a soft, dull gray, and the air smelled like damp leaves and pine. I had a mid-sized backpack with basic gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, first aid kit, flashlight, and a knife. I wore old hiking boots, jeans, and a flannel shirt over a thermal. My phone still had some signal where I parked, but I doubted it would last once I got deeper into the woods. That was fine with me. I locked the car, threw the straps of my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The trail was barely marked, just a faint path in the dirt, partly covered with leaves. It felt like I was the only person who had come through in a long time. No tire tracks, no beer cans or snack wrappers, just forest. About 2 hours in, I found a decent clearing beside a slow-moving creek. There were a few flat spots, dry ground, and no dead trees overhead. I could hear birds calling somewhere in the trees, and I saw a rabbit dart between some ferns as I dropped my pack. Felt perfect. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag inside, and stacked a few big rocks in a ring for a campfire. I had brought a small hatchet, and there were plenty of dead branches nearby. I took my time gathering wood, stripping bark, and stacking it to keep dry. The rest of the day went by peacefully. I made a small fire as the sun dropped behind the trees. I heated up a can of chili, ate slowly, and sat with my back against a log, staring into the flames until it got dark. When the fire burned low, I kicked dirt over the coals and crawled into my tent. It was so quiet out there at night. Just the sound of the creek trickling nearby and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. I zipped up my sleeping bag and stared at the fabric ceiling of the tent for a long time before I finally fell asleep. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up early, just after sunrise. The air was cold and damp. I put on an extra layer, stretched, and walked down to the creek to wash my face. The water was icy, but it woke me up. I made instant coffee over the fire and chewed on a granola bar. My plan was to hike deeper into the woods and just explore a bit, maybe follow the creek north for a while. By mid-morning, I had my small day pack on, and I was moving upstream. I didn't take much, just some water, a snack, and my knife. The creek twisted and curved through the trees, and after about an hour, the sound of birds started to fade. That's when I noticed something that made me pause. There were boot prints in the mud, just ahead of me, where the ground was soft from the creek. They looked fresh. I crouched down and looked closer. Definitely human. Not mine, they were bigger and the tread was different. I stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing, just wind and water. I didn't think much of it at first. This was still public land, even if it wasn't an official campground. Maybe someone else had come out here earlier that morning. I kept walking, but I paid more attention to the trail after that. About 15 minutes later, I spotted something odd between the trees up ahead. Plastic bag caught in a bush. I walked over and saw that it was a torn grocery bag, half buried in dirt. Next to it was an old, rusted camping stove. It looked like it had been there for months, maybe longer. There were broken branches nearby and what looked like a half-collapsed fire pit. Felt weird. The kind of thing you find in places where someone left in a hurry. Still, I shrugged it off. People abandon gear all the time. Maybe it broke. Maybe someone forgot it. I moved on, going farther than I planned to, and by early afternoon, I decided to loop back. I didn't want to be out too long without my main pack, and I wasn't tracking my route with GPS. I started cutting back toward where I thought camp was, not following the creek this time, but heading in a straight line southwest. That's when I saw the tree. At first it looked like it had been struck by lightning. Blackened on one side, bark ripped off, and a deep gouge about chest height. But there was no burn, no charring, just stripped wood and deep claw-like scrapes. Not natural ones. I got closer and saw marks that looked like they had been made by a knife or a saw. Deliberate cuts. Someone had hacked into it. I looked around. There were more trees nearby with similar marks. I counted 5 within sight, all with weird scrapes or bark stripped away. Some had carvings, lines and circles that didn't seem like symbols, more like someone had been testing a blade. Suddenly, the woods didn't feel so empty anymore. I turned fast when I heard a crack behind me, just a squirrel darting through the brush. I exhaled slowly and tried to push the tension down. I made my way back to camp faster than I'd planned. When I got back, nothing was moved. My tent was still there, firewood untouched, everything exactly how I left it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept hearing noises, not big ones, just soft snaps, something stepping on twigs, maybe far off, maybe close. I'd jolt up in my sleeping bag, ears straining, but it would go quiet again. Then nothing. Morning came slowly, and I was tired and stiff. I packed some stuff into my bag and decided not to hike far that day. Just stay close to camp, keep the fire going, maybe read. I had a book with me, but I couldn't focus. I kept looking into the trees, thinking I heard something. Around noon, I spotted something new near the edge of the clearing, something hanging from a low branch. I walked over and saw it was a tin can, hung by a string of black cord. Inside the can were pebbles, and as the wind moved, they rattled softly. I hadn't put that there. I stood still, staring at it. It wasn't old. The can was clean. The cord wasn't frayed. Someone had put that there, probably last night, and they had done it while I was asleep. I felt my stomach drop. I walked in a circle around my camp, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything. I wanted to leave, but I told myself maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a prank left by someone who camped here before. Maybe I'd missed it earlier. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat up with my knife in my hand, the fire burning high. I didn't let it die down. I kept feeding it wood until I ran out of the dry stuff. I watched the trees for hours. At some point, I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes again, it was light out. The fire was cold and dead, and I was shivering. That was when I found the footprints. They were about 20 feet from my tent, just off to the side, where the dirt was soft. 2 prints, bare feet, adult-sized, 1 foot slightly in front of the other, as if the person had been standing still, facing the tent. Watching, I didn't even think. I packed everything in a frenzy, stuffing gear into my bag without rolling it up right. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just wanted to be gone. I followed my original trail back the way I came, but it felt different. The trees felt closer together. The wind sounded like whispers. Every few minutes I stopped and looked back. I thought I saw someone once, a shape between trees, but when I looked straight at it, nothing was there. When I reached the dirt road, I almost cried. My car was still there. I opened the door, threw my pack inside, slammed it shut, and locked it from the inside as soon as I sat down. I drove for nearly an hour without stopping, not even looking at the rearview mirror. When I finally reached town, I parked at a gas station and sat in the car for 10 minutes, just breathing. Back at home, I didn't tell anyone. What would I even say? That someone walked around barefoot in the woods and watched me sleep? That someone hung a rattle trap made from a can? That they never spoke, never showed themselves, never did anything violent? But I still felt like I was being hunted? A few days later, I searched online for anything about that area. I found nothing. No missing persons, no warnings, nothing about old campsites or weird people in the woods. Just normal forest. But I knew what I saw. I haven't gone camping since then. I still think about it sometimes. What would have happened if I stayed another night? If I hadn't noticed the can? If I hadn't left when I did? There was no ghost, no monster, no demon, just someone else out there. Someone who knew how to move quietly. Someone who didn't want to be seen. And maybe someone who didn't want me there. The sun was just dipping below the thick line of pine trees when I finally parked the car at the edge of the trailhead. The air smelled sharp and clean, with the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A chance to get away from everything and just be alone with nature. No phone signal, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. The place I chose wasn't a busy campground. It was one of those backcountry spots off the beaten path where you had to hike in a little way to reach the clearing where I planned to camp. I grabbed my backpack, loaded with all the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, plenty of food and water, and a small first aid kit. The weight was familiar on my shoulders, comforting in a way. I double-checked the map I'd printed out earlier and started down the narrow dirt trail. The ground was soft beneath my boots, covered in pine needles that muffled my footsteps. Birds called quietly in the treetops, and the sun's last golden rays filtered through the branches, casting long shadows that stretched across the path. The trail twisted and turned, climbing slightly here, dipping there. The deeper I went, the more the noise of civilization faded until all I could hear was the rustling of the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. I felt a calm settle over me, the kind that only comes when you're truly out in the wild, far from the buzz and rush of everyday life. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing. It was perfect, just big enough for my tent, with a flat patch of ground and a fire ring left by previous campers. A fallen log sat nearby, perfect for sitting while I cooked or just watching the stars later. I set up camp carefully, driving stakes into the soft soil and rolling out my sleeping bag inside the tent. The sun had disappeared now, and the forest was turning blue and gray in the fading light. I built a small fire, stacking dry wood I'd gathered along the trail and striking a match carefully. The flame caught quickly, and the warm glow pushed back the dark edges of the clearing. I warmed some canned beans over the fire and ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the taste of food that somehow felt more satisfying when cooked over an open flame. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun was gone, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I sat on the log, watching sparks drift up into the night sky. The stars came out one by one, brilliant and clear. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a dusty river of light. It was the kind of view you never really get to see in the city, and it felt humbling and vast. After dinner, I crawled into my tent, zipped the door shut, and settled in for the night. The sounds of the forest were different in the dark, softer, deeper. Crickets chirped steadily, and somewhere nearby, a woodpecker tapped rhythmically on a tree trunk. Every now and then, a breeze whispered through the branches, rustling the needles and making the tent flap gently. I closed my eyes, letting the sounds lull me towards sleep, but something didn't feel quite right. At first, it was just a faint noise, almost too soft to be sure I heard it, like a footstep on dry leaves or a twig snapping in the distance. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving nearby. That's part of camping, after all. The wilderness is full of life, and you have to expect that. But then the noise came again, a slow, steady crunching, as if someone or something was walking carefully around the edge of my clearing. The sound was too deliberate, too measured to be a wild animal. It wasn't random like the steps of a squirrel or a rabbit fleeing through the brush. This was something else. My heart rate sped up. I reached for the flashlight I kept inside the tent and aimed it toward the tent door, shining a thin beam of light into the black. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, just beyond the firelight's reach, I thought I saw a shadow moving between the trees. My breath caught. The shadow didn't look like any animal I knew. It was upright, tall, and slow. I forced myself to stay still, listening hard. The noise stopped. The forest fell silent again, except for the normal night sounds of insects and distant birds. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my imagination playing tricks after a long day on the trail. Still, sleep didn't come easily. Hours later, I woke to a sudden, loud snap nearby, like a heavy branch breaking. My eyes shot open, and my heart thudded painfully in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight again, clicked it on, and shone it outside the tent. The clearing was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. But then, something caught my eye. The fire was nearly out, the embers cold and dark. I scrambled out of the tent, feeling the cold ground under my boots. I scanned the tree line, trying to find the source of the noise. A faint crunching sound came from the other side of the clearing. I took a slow step forward, then another, flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. Something was definitely out there. Someone. The thought hit me hard, sending adrenaline rushing through my veins. I wasn't alone in this forest. I thought about packing up immediately, but the trail back was a couple of hours hike, and I was deep in the woods. If whoever was out there wanted to cause trouble, I had no way of calling for help. No backup, no one to turn to. My phone was dead, no signal out here at all. I needed a plan. I grabbed my camping knife and a heavy stick I'd used to poke the fire earlier. With one hand gripping the flashlight, the other holding the makeshift weapon, I moved cautiously back toward the fire pit. My breath came out in visible clouds in the cold night air, and every crackle of the dry leaves beneath my boots sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. When I reached the fire pit, I saw the ground was disturbed. Footprints. Large, heavy prints in the soft earth around the edge of the clearing. Not animal tracks, human. My stomach tightened. Whoever had been there was big and careful enough to circle the clearing slowly, but they had left these prints. Maybe they weren't as careful as they thought. I looked around the perimeter, shining my light on the trees and bushes. No sign of movement, no eyes reflecting back at me, but I could feel it, the weight of being watched, the feeling that something was just beyond the beam's reach. I decided to pack my gear and leave. I couldn't stay here another night with someone lurking around. Back inside the tent, I started breaking down my camp quickly. My hands were shaking, fumbling with tent stakes and packing the sleeping bag. Every noise outside made me jump. The rustle of leaves, the snapping of a twig, the sudden hoot of an owl. I had just finished stuffing the tent into its bag when I heard footsteps again, closer this time. Heavy, slow steps on the dirt, circling around my sight. I froze. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing, fast and shallow. Then a low sound, a growl maybe, or a throat clearing. Couldn't be sure. Whatever it was, it wasn't an animal. I grabbed my knife, heart pounding, and backed away slowly toward the trail. My pack was ready now, and I hoisted it on my shoulders, moving as quietly as I could in the dark. Once I was at the edge of the clearing, I stopped and listened. The footsteps were gone. The forest was silent except for the wind in the branches. I started walking, fast but careful, following the trail back toward the car. My headlamp made a narrow cone of light ahead of me, and I kept looking over my shoulder. The hike felt longer in the dark. The trail, which had seemed peaceful in the daylight, now felt like a maze. Every shadow looked like a figure waiting to step out. Every sound seemed like a warning. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the glow of my car's headlights up ahead. Relief flooded through me like a wave. I broke into a run, heart hammering, lungs burning with cold air. When I reached the car, I locked the doors behind me and sat inside for a long moment, trying to calm down. I didn't want to believe what I thought I had seen out there. But the footprints, the sounds, the feeling, it was all real. I started the engine, and the heater blasted warm air across my face. I drove away slowly, looking back at the dark trees until the trail disappeared behind me. The forest was supposed to be a place to find peace and quiet. But sometimes the wilderness has a way of reminding you that you're not alone, and sometimes that's the scariest thing of all. When I got back to town, I reported what happened to the park rangers. They told me they hadn't had any recent reports of hikers going missing, but they said they'd send someone to check the area. I didn't hear back after that, but I never went back to that spot. Looking back, I think what scared me most wasn't just the footsteps or the presence I felt. It was how unprepared I was for the reality that there are people out there, in the woods, who might mean harm. No ghost stories, no monsters, just real danger, the kind that lurks quietly, waiting for the right moment. I learned that night to respect the wild not just for its beauty, but for its unpredictability, and to always be ready for the unexpected. Camping will always be a part of me, but after that trip, I never took it lightly again. I made sure to tell others what I experienced. The late afternoon sun was soft and warm as I drove my old truck down the gravel road that led deep into the forest. I had been planning this camping trip for months. Just me, my gear, and the quiet woods. The trees stretched tall and thick on either side of the road, casting long shadows across the dusty path. I breathed in the smell of pine and damp earth through the open window. It was a calm day, the kind that made you feel like the world had slowed down for a moment. I pulled up to the spot I'd chosen weeks ago, a small clearing beside a slow-moving creek, far from any marked trails or other campers. The place was perfect for what I wanted. Solitude, fresh air, and a break from everything. I parked the truck and unloaded my backpack carefully, making sure I had everything I needed. Tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, water, some canned food, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. Nothing fancy, just the basics. Setting up the tent took a little longer than I expected because the ground was uneven and covered in thick roots. I found a spot that was flat enough and drove the stakes deep into the soil. The tent's fabric rustled softly in the light breeze, and I could hear the faint sound of water trickling from the creek nearby. I stood back and looked around. The forest was alive with small noises, the chirping of birds, the occasional rustle of leaves as a squirrel or rabbit darted through the brush. By the time I finished setting up camp, the sun was lower, casting golden light through the trees. I built a small fire pit using stones I gathered from around the clearing and carefully stacked some dry wood. After a few tries, I managed to get a fire going. The smell of burning pine needles filled the air, and I felt a little more at home. I sat on a log beside the fire, my knees pulled close to my chest. The warmth was welcome against the cool air that was settling in as the sun dipped behind the trees. I took a sip of water and stared into the flames, watching how they twisted and flickered. There was a peacefulness in that moment, a feeling of being part of something much bigger than myself. As the sky darkened, I grabbed my flashlight and started preparing a simple dinner. Canned beans heated over the fire. The metal can hissed as the food warmed, and I carefully stirred it with a stick I found nearby. The quiet was deepening around me now. No sounds of other people, just the forest breathing. Occasionally, the sharp cry of a distant bird echoed through the night. After dinner, I cleaned up my small cooking area, making sure to pack away anything that might attract animals. I was careful with the fire, letting it burn down to glowing embers before covering it with dirt and stones. The last thing I wanted was a forest fire or an unwanted visitor. I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap closed, and settled into my sleeping bag. The ground underneath was hard, but the sleeping bag was warm and comforting. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of running water from the creek. It was peaceful, too peaceful, maybe. I lay still in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest. Then, something caught my attention. A sharp crack, like a twig breaking, not far from the clearing. I froze. The sound was close, maybe just beyond the tree line. It was nothing unusual in the woods. Animals often moved around at night, but the crack was louder than normal, sharper, like someone stepping on dry branches with heavy boots. I waited, nothing else. Then, another crack, closer this time. My heart beat a little faster, but I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. I wasn't afraid, not really, but I decided to stay inside the tent for a while longer before trying to get some sleep. Minutes passed, then an odd sound drifted through the trees. A low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled over rocks or dirt. It was slow and steady, almost methodical. I tried to make sense of it, but couldn't. The forest was so dark outside the thin tent fabric that I couldn't see anything. My mind began to race with possibilities. Wild animals, maybe a bear or a large boar, but bears usually made more noise when they moved, and boars grunt and snort. This dragging sound was different, more deliberate. I reached for my flashlight, thinking I might peek outside. As I unzipped the tent flap just a few inches, the cool night air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. I flashed the light into the darkness, but I didn't see anything. No glowing eyes, no moving shapes, just the black shadow of trees. I shut the flap quickly, feeling a chill. The dragging noise stopped right then, and everything went quiet again. I could still hear the creak, faint and constant, but no other sounds. It was as if whatever had been there had vanished. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself I was imagining things. The forest was full of sounds that could easily trick your mind at night, especially when you were alone. Still, sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts kept returning to those noises. Suddenly, there was a soft thump against the side of my tent. Not a loud bang, just a dull, muffled sound, like something pressing lightly on the fabric. I held my breath. The thump happened again, slower this time, and then a faint scraping noise, like nails or claws running along the canvas. My heart slammed against my ribs. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent all the way. I swung the light around the clearing quickly, trying to catch whatever was outside. Nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the dark trees and the glowing embers of the fire pit now smothered with dirt. I grabbed my small pocket knife from my backpack and held it in one hand, the flashlight in the other. I slowly stood up and stepped out of the tent. The air was cool against my skin, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. I scanned the area carefully. The ground around the tent had small marks, indentations in the dirt, faint but there. Something had been there right up against the tent. I crouched and examined the marks more closely. They looked like paw prints, but bigger than any animal I was familiar with in the area. Maybe a large dog or a coyote. I'd never seen anything quite like them. As I looked around, I noticed the firewood pile I had stacked earlier was scattered. Some logs were knocked over, and pieces of bark had been stripped from nearby trees. My mind raced with questions. Was this an animal? Had someone been near my camp? I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, but the way the logs were thrown around felt like more than random animal behavior. I gathered some of the logs and stacked them carefully again, making the fire pit ready to light if I needed. I decided to stay awake until dawn. I lit the fire with trembling hands, watching the flames grow and crackle. The light pushed back the darkness around the clearing, but I kept my knife close and the flashlight within reach. The hours passed slowly. Every small noise made me jump. The forest was alive with sounds: the rustle of leaves, the cry of night birds, the distant howl of a coyote. But none of those sounds felt threatening. It was the silence between that felt heavy, like waiting for something to happen. Just before dawn, I saw movement on the edge of the clearing. A shadow slipped between the trees, quick and low. I aimed my flashlight but lost it in the thick brush. I stayed still, heart pounding, waiting for morning. When the first light came, the forest changed. The shadows shrank, and the world looked softer. I packed up my gear quickly, careful not to leave anything behind. I didn't want to stay another night. On the way back to the truck, I stopped to look around the clearing again. There were more paw prints and strange marks near the creek, as if something had been stalking the area for a while. When I reached the truck and turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I felt relief flood through me. Driving away from the woods, the sun rose higher, and the trees thinned out. I promised myself I'd come back, but only with company and better preparation. The forest was beautiful and peaceful by day, but at night, it held secrets better left alone. That trip stayed with me, the feeling of being watched, the strange noises, and the marks around my camp. It was a reminder that sometimes, the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. Sometimes they're just the unknown, the wild, and the creatures that live in the dark places where we don't belong. But I also learned I was stronger than my fear. I had faced the night, and when morning came, I was still here, safe and ready to face whatever came next. I planned the trip for months. I hadn't been out of the city in nearly a year, and between the job, bills, and the noise of everyday life, I just needed to breathe. My plan was simple: head out to an area in Central Oregon, just beyond the Deschutes National Forest, not too far from Bend. I didn't pick a popular spot. I looked at some old forestry maps, marked a few trails that weren't part of the main tourist zones, and picked a location deep in the woods, a few miles from the closest designated camping area. I packed everything over the course of a week: a one-person tent, sleeping bag rated for the chilly mountain nights, bear canister, propane stove, a small hatchet, a fixed-blade knife, first aid kit, map and compass, backup GPS, and enough food and water for 4 days. I left my car at the edge of an old logging road, about a 45-minute drive from any real town. The car would be hidden enough off the road that no one would bother it, and I hiked in from there, following an overgrown trail that looked like it hadn't seen regular foot traffic in years. The weather was perfect for late September. It was still warm during the day, but the air had that crisp edge that meant fall was coming fast. My first day hiking in was easy. I followed a ridgeline with a view of the hills rolling down into a wide basin of thick forest. I didn't see a single person the entire hike. No distant campers, no hikers, just the wind moving through the trees, the smell of pine needles underfoot, and the occasional squirrel or bird that would flit past. It was exactly what I wanted. I made camp that first night in a small clearing that looked like it had been used long ago. There were the faint outlines of old fire rings made with moss-covered stones, and a few rotted stumps where someone had once sat or chopped wood. It was quiet, a little too quiet, but I was used to silence out here. I boiled some water, ate a dehydrated meal, read a bit, and fell asleep before it even got dark. I remember thinking how nice it was not to hear cars or sirens or anything artificial, just the wind and the distant chirp of insects that hadn't yet gone quiet for the season. The second day was when things started to feel off. I packed up early and hiked deeper in, wanting to get farther from any trails. I didn't use the GPS, just followed the map and my compass, making sure I always knew how to get back. Around midday, I came across what looked like an old animal trail heading down into a shallow gully. It was lined with ferns and fallen logs, and something about it felt natural but also unusual, like it wasn't used often, but it had been used. The dirt was compacted in places, like something heavy had moved through recently. I figured it was elk or maybe a black bear. Nothing unusual for the area. I followed it for a bit, thinking it might lead to a small stream. Instead, I came across what looked like an old hunting camp. Not a full campsite, just a few scraps. Some faded orange flagging tape tied to a tree limb, the remains of a collapsed tarp, and an old metal canteen half buried in the dirt. It had clearly been there for years, maybe decades. I kicked around the site for a bit, not expecting to find anything useful, and I didn't. Still, it gave me a strange feeling, like I was walking through someone's memory. Whoever had camped here hadn't taken care to clean up. That night, I camped about half a mile farther on slightly higher ground beneath a thick canopy of fir trees. The air was colder and everything was damp. I had to set up camp quickly before the sun dropped behind the hills. I kept my routine the same: cook, clean up, store the food in the bear canister, and double-check everything before bed. I heard movement that night, not the usual small animal rustling, but something heavier. I was almost asleep when I heard what sounded like slow, deliberate steps moving through the undergrowth maybe 30 yards from the tent. The ground was soft out here, so for something to make that much noise, it had to be large. I sat up inside the tent and listened for at least 10 minutes. It wasn't moving toward me, but it was circling. I couldn't hear breathing or growling, but I could tell it wasn't a deer. Whatever it was too quiet to be panicking and too steady to be random. After a while, the sound faded away, and I convinced myself it was a curious bear passing through. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. I kept my knife next to my sleeping bag and lay there, listening to every creak of the trees. The next morning, I got out early and checked the area. I didn't see tracks at first, but then I found some indentations in the soft earth about 20 feet from my tent. They weren't clear paw prints or boot marks, just long, deep impressions like someone or something heavy had stepped there but hadn't left a defined print. The ground was too mossy to hold detail. I tried to shake it off, told myself again it had to be a bear. I kept moving that day, deciding to make a wide loop instead of going deeper. Something about the area was starting to bother me, and I figured I could make it back to the original camp by the fourth night and head back to the car from there. The forest got denser, and the air started to feel heavier. I came across more old signs of human activity. An old trail marker nailed into a tree so faded I couldn't read the paint, a rusted coil of barbed wire half buried under roots, and a decaying wooden crate near the base of a slope. None of it looked recent. By late afternoon, I found a new place to set up, a small rise overlooking a dry creek bed. It felt safer, more visible, even though the view was just trees and shadows. As I unpacked, I noticed something strange. Some of the food in my bear canister had been tampered with. The lid was secure, tight just like I'd left it, but one of the packets inside was torn open, and a few protein bars were missing. There were no bite marks or claw scratches on the plastic. It looked like someone had opened it properly, gone through it, and then resealed the lid. That changed everything. An animal wouldn't do that. Person would. I checked the perimeter, but there were no obvious signs of someone else nearby. No footprints, no broken branches or trash. I felt a creeping pressure building in my chest as the sun started to go down. I decided not to start a fire that night. I ate cold food, cleaned up quietly, and got inside the tent as soon as it was dark. I left my boots on and the knife in my hand. I didn't sleep. I just lay there in total silence, heart thudding, waiting for some sound outside to tell me I wasn't alone. And sure enough, just after midnight, I heard movement again. But this time, it wasn't slow. It was fast. Snapping twigs, rustling leaves, low footfalls moving just past the edge of my camp. Then silence. A long silence. I was sitting up inside the tent, knife still clutched, listening so hard it hurt. Then I heard the sound that made my blood go cold. The zipper of the bear canister. Someone outside was opening it again. It was unmistakable. I froze. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After maybe 30 seconds, the sound stopped, and everything went quiet again. Then I heard slow, retreating steps like whoever or whatever had come was now leaving. I didn't sleep a second that night. In the morning, the canister was open, and more food was missing. Same clean, careful removal, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I decided I had to get out. I packed up everything as fast as I could. Didn't even bother with breakfast. I got out my map and took the fastest route back toward where I'd started 2 days earlier. I figured if I could make good time, I could reach my original site by nightfall and be out by late morning the next day. But as I moved, I got the feeling I was being watched. Not constantly, just these brief flashes of awareness, like eyes on the back of my neck. I kept stopping to listen, thinking I'd hear footsteps or a branch snap, but it was always just silence. Too much silence. No birds, no wind, just me and my breathing. That afternoon, I found a tree that had been freshly marked. A clean, horizontal slash into the bark about shoulder height. It was deliberate, and worse, I hadn't passed that tree on the way in. That meant someone had been moving behind me, following. I moved faster. I started jogging sections of the trail, even though I was carrying almost 50 pounds of gear. My legs were burning, and I was sweating hard, but I didn't stop. I finally made it back to the original camp just before sunset, and I set up quickly. Again, no fire, no cooking, just cold food and silence. I didn't even put up the tent. I lay low under a tree with my sleeping bag and kept watch all night. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard breathing. Close, slow and deliberate. Not mine, not an animal, human. It was just beyond the darkness, just past the edge of where I could see. It lasted maybe a minute, then faded. But I didn't sleep after that. I didn't move. I stayed frozen under that tree until dawn. As soon as there was light, I started hiking again, this time straight toward the car. I didn't stop to eat, didn't take breaks, just moved as fast as I could, keeping my knife in one hand the whole time. By mid-morning, I was back on the old logging road, and when I finally saw my car, I felt this wave of relief so strong it made my knees weak. I didn't even check the surrounding area. I just unlocked the door, threw my gear in the back, and got in. The sun was already dipping below the trees by the time I reached the edge of the forest. The sky was streaked with soft pink and orange clouds, the kind that make you pause and feel small. I carried my backpack carefully over the uneven ground, the weight of it a familiar comfort. It had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and the little extras that make camping bearable. A flashlight, a small first aid kit, and some maps I had printed out earlier. This trip was supposed to be a simple solo camping weekend, just me and the woods. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the endless stream of notifications, the crowd, and the constant buzz of life. The idea of being completely alone in nature, with nothing but the sound of wind and birds, was what I was craving. The forest was dense, old growth, with tall pines and oaks towering overhead. The ground was soft and thick with fallen leaves, needles, and patches of moss. Every step I took sent tiny clouds of dust and leaves drifting into the air. I could hear the steady chirping of crickets, the occasional rustle of a squirrel or chipmunk moving through the underbrush. After about an hour of hiking, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees and over shallow streams, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing surrounded by tall pines that blocked most of the wind. The ground was flat and covered with dry leaves, perfect for pitching my tent. Nearby, a small creek babbled quietly, its water clear and cold. I set down my pack, unrolled my sleeping bag, and started putting up the tent. The poles clicked together with practiced ease, and the fabric stretched tight against the frame. The smell of fresh pine and damp earth filled the air. Setting up camp felt like a ritual to me. Simple, peaceful, grounding. Once the tent was secure, I gathered some dry wood and twigs for a fire. The forest was already dimming, shadows stretching long across the ground. The last bits of daylight filtered through the trees, casting a soft glow on everything. The air was cool but not cold, with a slight breeze that smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. I arranged the wood carefully, starting a small pile with kindling at the center. After a few strikes, the lighter sparked and caught. A small flame flickered, then grew, casting a warm light that pushed back the darkening forest around me. The fire crackled and popped as it ate the dry wood, and I settled in close, the heat warming my hands. As I sat there, I took out a small tin of beans I had heated over the fire. The food was nothing fancy, but it tasted good after the long hike. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the feeling of being far away from everything familiar. The stars started to appear one by one, bright pinpricks in the sky above the tree line. I lay back on my sleeping bag and looked up through the gaps in the branches. The Milky Way was faint but visible, a river of stars flowing overhead. The sounds of the forest at night surrounded me. The steady chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl far off, the rustle of leaves as a light breeze blew. I felt a deep calm, the kind that only comes from being completely alone in nature. I thought about how small I was compared to this vast, old forest, and how lucky I was to be here. But as the night deepened, that calm started to shift. The wind grew stronger, making the trees creak and groan. Shadows seemed to stretch and move in ways that weren't quite right. I reminded myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, the kind of feelings that come when you're alone and tired. Still, something was off. Around midnight, I woke up from a light sleep to a noise. It was a low, scraping sound, like something dragging over the ground. I froze, heart pounding. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the forest was nearly pitch black. My flashlight was on the ground beside me, but I didn't want to reach for it yet. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere outside the clearing. I strained my ears, trying to make sense of it. It wasn't animal-like, not the usual rustle of a deer or raccoon. It sounded more mechanical or like heavy boots dragging. My mind raced. Could someone be out there? Was someone following the trail? I remembered reading about campers getting stalked or robbed in the woods. The thought made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam around the clearing. The trees loomed dark and still. Nothing moved. I forced myself to calm down, telling myself that maybe it was just a branch falling or an animal. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I decided to keep the fire going, adding dry wood to keep the light and warmth. The fire flickered against the darkness, but I kept my flashlight ready. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I heard a faint snap, like a twig breaking. The sound was close, too close. I swung the flashlight in that direction, heart pounding. The beam caught something, a figure standing just beyond the trees. I couldn't see clearly. The figure was partially hidden in shadow, tall and still. My mind froze. I wanted to call out, to ask who it was, but my voice felt stuck. The figure didn't move. After a long moment, it turned and disappeared silently into the forest. I sat there, frozen, flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind was racing through every possible scenario. Was it someone lost? A hunter? Someone dangerous? I packed up the fire quickly, deciding it was better to be safe than sorry. I stuffed my food and gear into my backpack, zipped up the tent, and slung it over my shoulder. The forest felt suddenly hostile, the darkness thicker. I started walking down the trail, flashlight cutting a narrow path ahead. My legs moved fast but carefully over roots and rocks. Every sound made me jump. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the distant howl of a coyote. I didn't stop until I reached the dirt road that led back to the parking lot. The moon was low, casting pale light over the open space. I could see my car's headlights in the distance, and I ran the last few hundred meters. Once inside, I locked the doors and started the engine, heart still racing. The warmth of the car felt like a shield against the dark forest outside. Driving back, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure again. But the road was empty, silent. That night, I realized that the forest, while beautiful and peaceful, could also be unpredictable and a little dangerous. Sometimes the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters, they're just other people or the unknown. I didn't go back to that spot, but I still think about that night. The way the figure stood there, watching, silent and still. It was a reminder to respect the wild and be careful when you venture into it alone. But I'm glad I went, because even though it scared me, it also taught me something important about trust, awareness, and the quiet strength it takes to face fear head-on. I set out for the trip early in the morning, with the sky just starting to brighten behind the distant hills. The air was fresh, a little chilly but promising warmth later. I had packed my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 3 days, water bottles, a map, a compass, and some extra clothes. I was going to camp alone in the forest, in a spot I had never been to before. I wanted the silence, the escape, and the chance to be completely on my own. The drive took me through winding roads flanked by tall trees, their green leaves flickering in the morning light. The forest grew thicker the closer I got to the trailhead, a small dirt path barely wide enough for a single car. I parked, double-checked my backpack, and started walking down the trail. It was well-marked but not crowded. I didn't see many signs of people, only the usual tracks of deer and the occasional bird fluttering overhead. The forest smelled like pine and earth. The ground was soft underfoot, carpeted with fallen leaves and needles. The sun filtered through the branches, making patterns on the dirt. I took slow, deep breaths, feeling the tension from the city start to fade. After about 2 hours of hiking, I reached a small clearing near a creek. The sound of running water was gentle and steady. The spot seemed perfect to set up camp. I chose a flat patch of ground a little above the creek to avoid dampness and spread out my gear. Setting up the tent took some time, but it felt good to be active. I hammered the stakes into the ground and stretched the fabric tight, making sure everything was secure. With the tent up, I gathered some dry wood nearby to start a fire later. The forest floor was thick with fallen branches and pine cones, easy fuel if dry. I stacked some kindling carefully in a little fire pit I cleared of leaves and debris. I rested for a moment, leaning back against a tree and sipping water. The silence was almost total, broken only by the trickling creek and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I felt completely alone, but not lonely. I spent the afternoon exploring the area, walking upstream along the creek. The water was clear, cold, and refreshing. I saw tracks, probably deer and raccoon, and a few bird nests tucked high in the branches. The woods were alive with quiet signs of wildlife. I made mental notes of the landscape, where the sun would be, which paths seemed easier to follow, and where the thickest brush was. I was aware of how quickly weather could change in the mountains, so I stayed alert. Back at camp, I prepared dinner. I heated some canned beans and rice on my small stove, savoring the simple meal in the open air. As dusk settled, the sky turned pink and orange behind the trees. I sat near the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones. The firelight flickered over the dark shapes of the trees, and shadows stretched long on the ground. That night, I crawled into my sleeping bag and zipped the tent closed. The sounds of the forest changed after dark. I heard owls hooting somewhere in the distance and the occasional snap of a twig. The wind whispered through the branches above, making the tent fabric flap gently. I lay awake for a while, feeling the cool night air on my face. Around midnight, I woke to a strange sound outside the tent. It wasn't a typical animal noise. It was a heavy, slow crunching, like something big moving through the underbrush just beyond the clearing. My heart sped up, but I forced myself to breathe steadily. I knew that animals like bears or wild boars were possible in this forest. I had packed bear spray and kept my food sealed and away from the tent. The noise stopped after a few minutes, and silence returned. I stayed still for a long time, listening carefully. Eventually, I fell back asleep, though my rest was lighter and more uneasy. The next morning, I packed a little breakfast and started exploring further up the trail. The sun was higher, and the forest felt different in daylight, safer, more open. I found some small patches of wild berries, careful to only pick those I was sure were edible. The landscape changed slowly, with rocky outcrops rising among the trees. I climbed one to get a better view. From the top, I could see the vast forest stretching in every direction, a sea of green broken by distant rivers shining in the sunlight. After returning to camp, I decided to check the creek area more closely. Near the bank, I spotted fresh tracks in the mud. Large paw prints, unmistakably from a bear. They headed downstream toward a thick patch of brush. That explained the noise from the night before. My stomach tightened. The thought of a bear so close made me more cautious. I double-checked my food storage, making sure nothing was left near the tent. I hung the food bag from a high tree branch, well away from the campsite, as I had learned from guides. I kept my bear spray and a sturdy stick within reach. The afternoon passed quietly, and I tried to focus on the small beauty around me. The way sunlight made the creek water sparkle, the fresh green moss covering the rocks, the occasional bright feather dropped by a passing bird. As evening came, I prepared another simple meal, this time heating some soup. I sat by the fire again, watching the flames dance and listening to the forest sounds. The sky was clear, stars beginning to appear through the branches. The fire made the cold air bearable. I noticed the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves more loudly now. The forest felt alive with movement, small animals foraging, the occasional distant call of a bird or mammal. Suddenly, I heard a louder noise outside the clearing, branches snapping sharply and heavy footsteps crunching through leaves. This time, it was closer than before, and the sound was deliberate. My heart pounded. I grabbed my bear spray and flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and bushes. There was nothing visible at first, but the noise continued, moving just beyond the light's reach. I stood frozen, ready to defend myself if needed. The noise slowed, then stopped. After a few tense minutes, I decided to stay inside the tent, zipped up tight, and tried to calm my nerves. Sleep came reluctantly that night. I lay awake imagining what might have been out there. I knew fear could be as dangerous as the animals themselves. I focused on slow breathing, reminding myself I was prepared and alert. Morning came cold and gray. I packed up my camp slowly, every movement deliberate. I wanted to leave while the weather was still clear. The wind was stronger now, carrying the scent of rain. I folded my tent carefully, packed my gear, and took one last look around. The forest was peaceful in daylight, the earlier tension already fading. I followed the trail back toward the car, stepping carefully on the damp ground. I thought about the night's noises, the tracks, the signs I had seen. The forest was wild and unpredictable, but it was also alive and full of quiet beauty. When I reached the car, I felt a rush of relief. I had been out there alone, faced real uncertainty, and come through it safely. The trip had tested me, but it also reminded me how important it was to respect nature, to be cautious but not fearful, and to appreciate the simple things. The sound of running water, the rustle of leaves, the way light moves through trees. I started the engine, the car's warmth a welcome comfort. As I drove away from the forest, I glanced back through the rear window. The trees stood tall and silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The forest held many secrets, some frightening, some beautiful, and it was up to those who entered it to be ready. This trip wasn't about escaping danger or finding thrills. It was about learning patience, awareness, and respect for the wild world. I was grateful for the experience, the solitude, and the chance to reconnect with something larger than myself. I left for the mountains in early September, right after quitting a job I couldn't stand anymore. I'd been pushing through 12-hour shifts in a loud warehouse, running on energy drinks and barely any sleep. I didn't even really plan the trip. I just loaded my old Ford Explorer with gear, threw in a cooler with food and water, and drove north. I wanted silence, isolation, a place where no one could reach me. I wasn't even sure how long I'd be gone. Maybe a few days, maybe a week. I figured I'd camp until I felt right again. I stopped at a gas station in a small town before heading into the range. The guy working the counter told me about a fire road that ran way up into the national forest. It wasn't on most maps, and he said it was real quiet up there. That was exactly what I wanted. I found the road about 10 miles past the edge of town. It was rough, just gravel and dirt, full of potholes and fallen branches, and it wound steeply upward for a long time. I drove slow and steady, careful not to blow a tire or scrape the bottom of the SUV. After almost an hour of bouncing up that trail, I found a small clearing just off the main path. It was surrounded by thick trees, with a shallow creek maybe 50 feet away. There were no signs anyone else had camped there for years. No garbage, no tracks, no burnt-out fire rings. Just quiet and space. I parked under some trees and set up camp slowly. I wasn't in a rush. I had a 2-person tent, a folding chair, a gas burner, and a sleeping bag rated for cold nights. I unpacked a small hatchet, a flashlight, my boots, and some basic first aid gear. My phone had lost signal halfway up the fire road, but I didn't mind. I didn't bring it for anything besides maybe taking a few pictures. The first day felt good. I hiked around a little, mostly following the creek as it twisted down through the trees. The air smelled like pine and dirt and cold water. I didn't see any animals, but I found prints. Deer, raccoon, maybe a bobcat. Nothing alarming. The ground was soft with fallen needles, and there were thick ferns in patches between the trees. That night, I built a small fire and cooked a can of chili on the burner. I watched the flames and listened to the forest settle into its nighttime sounds. Crickets, a few rustlings, wind brushing through the canopy. Felt like what I'd been needing for a long time. I slept better than I had in months. The second day, I hiked farther, venturing maybe 2 miles from camp. I carried a small pack with water, a knife, and a snack, and kept track of my path carefully. I followed the creek again, then veered off toward a ridge I'd seen from my camp. I climbed it slowly and reached the top by mid-afternoon. The view was incredible. Miles of forest in every direction, the occasional glint of water in the distance. I sat on a rock for a while and just took it in. It was so quiet I could hear the blood in my ears. When I got back to camp that evening, I noticed something strange, but small. My folding chair was lying on its side. I was sure I'd left it open, set beside the fire pit. At first I thought maybe the wind had knocked it over, but there hadn't been any strong gusts that day. Still, I shrugged it off. Maybe I'd bumped it and forgotten. I was alone out here, and little things seemed bigger when you didn't have someone else to brush them off with. That night, I stayed up later than the night before, poking at the fire and staring into the trees. There was a tension in my chest that hadn't been there the first night, like I was waiting for something. Couldn't place it. I kept thinking about the chair. I don't know why it got to me so much, but it stuck in my mind. Around midnight, I heard a sound out in the woods. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a quick rustle, like something brushing past branches. It wasn't wind, though. It had weight. I turned off my headlamp and just sat there, listening. The fire had died down, so it was mostly dark except for a faint orange glow. The noise didn't repeat. I finally zipped myself into the tent and lay awake for a while, staring at the roof, ears straining for anything else. Nothing came. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I felt a little uneasy, but I pushed it down. I made coffee, cleaned up camp, and told myself it was just the woods playing tricks. I took another hike, shorter this time, and stayed within sight of the creek. I didn't want to go far. When I got back, I noticed something else. My hatchet was missing. I'd left it wedged in a tree stump near the tent, but now it was gone. I walked in slow circles, looking under everything. It wasn't there. I checked my SUV to see if I'd put it away without thinking. Nothing. That really got under my skin. I didn't hear anything in the night. No one creeping up, no engines or voices. But I knew I hadn't lost it. Someone had to have taken it. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, wrapped in my jacket, listening. I kept the flashlight and a knife close. The forest was still too still. Even the crickets were quiet. I kept checking behind me, scanning the shadows. I thought I saw movement once, just a flash between 2 trees, but it could have been my eyes. I slept inside the SUV that night, locked inside with the doors shut tight. It wasn't comfortable, but I felt safer. The next morning, I packed up. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I didn't believe it. Something was wrong here. I loaded the tent, the chair, everything back into the SUV, and started down the fire road. I got maybe a mile before I saw something up ahead. Fresh tire tracks. They weren't mine. The pattern was different and they were recent. I stopped the SUV and got out to look. The tracks turned off into a narrow path I hadn't noticed before, overgrown and hidden by brush. I stood there for a while, staring at that path, feeling the hair rise on the back of my neck. I didn't follow it. I got back in and kept driving, but I didn't make it far. Less than a mile down the road, I came around a bend and saw that someone had dragged a tree across the path. It wasn't huge, but it was thick enough to stop my SUV. I knew it hadn't been there before. I got out and checked it. Fresh drag marks in the dirt, still loose pine needles around it. Someone had put it there recently. I stood there for a long time trying to figure out what to do. I couldn't drive around it, and my small hatchet, if I still had it, would have taken hours to cut through that trunk. I had a saw blade in my gear, and I started working on it, sawing slowly, sweat dripping down my back even though the air was cool. Every 10 minutes I'd stop and listen. Nothing, but I felt eyes on me. I worked for hours, hands blistering, blade dulling. Finally, I got enough of a cut through to pull it apart, just barely clearing a space wide enough to drive over the stump. I didn't stop again. I kept going until I hit pavement. When I reached town, I pulled into the first gas station I saw and sat there for a while, just breathing. I checked my phone, no messages, no calls. I didn't call anyone. I didn't know what I'd say. I filled the tank, bought a hot coffee even though my hands were shaking, and drove straight through until I was home. For a while after that, I tried to forget the trip. I put my gear in storage, kept the SUV clean, didn't tell anyone the real story. I said I'd gotten bored of camping, that I was ready to work again. But I kept thinking about the chair, the missing hatchet, the tire tracks, the tree in the road, and I couldn't let go of the feeling that someone had been watching me from the moment I arrived. Months passed, and I eventually replaced my gear. I started hiking again, closer to home, never too far from a trailhead. I stayed away from deep forests and forgotten fire roads. I told myself I was being careful, not paranoid. But sometimes, even now, when I walk past thick woods or hear a branch snap where it shouldn't, that old feeling creeps back in. That sense that someone's out there, waiting quiet just past the trees. Not a ghost or a monster, just a person. Someone with time and patience and a reason I'll never understand. That's what still gets me. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but I know I wasn't supposed to see them. I think that's the only reason I made it out. I remember the day clearly, even though it was years ago. The kind of day that starts off with excitement and ends with a weight on your chest you didn't expect. It was early September, the kind of time when summer's heat is slowly fading but the nights are already hinting at cold. The perfect time for camping, I thought. I had decided to spend a few days alone in the wilderness, to get away from the noise and stress of daily life. No phone, no internet, just me and the forest. I packed my backpack carefully the night before. A tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, a small stove, water bottles, some extra clothes, a first aid kit, flashlight, and a good knife. I knew the area well enough. I had camped there before, though only with friends. This time, I wanted to try it alone. I had mapped out the spot deep inside a national forest about a 3-hour drive from my town. The road ended at a small parking area, and from there I planned to hike about 5 miles into the woods to find the perfect clearing I had scouted on a previous trip. The morning started cool and bright. I drove to the trailhead with my windows down, enjoying the fresh air and the smell of pine trees as I pulled into the parking lot. It was quiet, almost empty, which was exactly what I wanted. I strapped on my backpack and checked my gear once more before heading down the narrow trail. The hike was peaceful at first. The forest was alive with sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling with a gentle breeze, the distant call of a woodpecker. The path wound through tall trees, mostly pines and oaks, and the ground was soft with fallen needles and leaves. Every so often, I paused to look around or take a sip of water. I loved these moments, alone in the woods, where the noise of the city was replaced by nature's quiet rhythm. After about 2 hours, the trail grew steeper and narrower. I climbed a ridge and saw the valley below, where the river twisted through the trees like a silver ribbon. It was even more beautiful than I remembered. I took out my camera and snapped a few pictures, wanting to capture the feeling of being somewhere untouched. I finally reached the clearing I had planned to camp in by mid-afternoon. It was small but perfect, flat ground covered with soft grass, surrounded by tall trees on 3 sides, and a clear view of the sky. A small stream ran nearby, and I could hear the gentle trickle of water. I set up my tent carefully, making sure it was secure and away from the stream in case of rain. Then I gathered some dry wood for a fire later, stacking it neatly in a pile. By the time the sun started to lower, the forest changed. Shadows grew longer and the air cooled quickly. I started a fire, the flames crackling and sending sparks into the darkening sky. I cooked my dinner on the small stove, a simple meal of rice and canned beans, and ate slowly, watching the fire. The quiet was deep now, filled only by the sounds of night insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. After dinner, I laid back in my sleeping bag outside the tent, staring up at the stars. The sky was so clear that night, and the Milky Way stretched across it like a glowing path. I felt peaceful and alone, exactly what I wanted. Then I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, it was faint, barely audible over the crackling fire and night noises. But then it became clearer footsteps, not the soft padding of small animals, but heavier, slower steps moving through the brush nearby. I froze. My heart started to beat faster. The forest, which had felt safe and calm, suddenly felt huge and unknown. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness but showed nothing. The footsteps stopped. I waited, breath held, listening. Then I heard a low rustle again, just beyond the firelight. It was coming closer. I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there, moving slowly, watching me. I tightened my grip on the knife at my side. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the forest could be dangerous at night. Bears, wolves, or worse, people with bad intentions. I had no cell signal here, no way to call for help if something happened. The footsteps circled the clearing now, slow and careful, never breaking into a run, just steady movement. I stayed low, trying to stay quiet, making myself as small as possible. My fire still burned, but the flames were low, barely lighting the edges of the clearing. I thought about packing up and leaving, but the thought of hiking back in the dark with an unknown presence outside terrified me more. Time stretched painfully. The footsteps moved around the clearing for what felt like an hour, but I know it was probably less. My muscles ached from holding still. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped. Silence fell again. I didn't dare move until the sky showed the first hint of dawn. When the sun began to rise, the forest felt less threatening. I packed quickly, still on edge, and started walking back down the trail. I didn't stop to look behind me, just kept moving as fast as I could. The hike back felt different. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept my eyes on the path, my hands ready on my knife and flashlight. When I finally reached my car, relief flooded through me. I locked the doors, started the engine, and breathed deeply. On the drive home, I kept replaying the night in my head. What was out there? A lost hiker? An animal? Someone camping nearby who didn't want to be found? I never found out, but the experience taught me to respect the wilderness in a new way, to be prepared, alert, and always ready for the unexpected. That trip was supposed to be an escape, a peaceful break. Instead, it became a lesson in caution and survival. I never camped alone again after that, but I still love the forest. Just now, I know it holds mysteries that don't need ghosts or monsters to be scary. Sometimes the unknown is enough. It started with a plan I made on a quiet Friday afternoon. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of people and traffic, the endless emails and deadlines. My work had been piling up, and my head felt heavy with stress. I needed fresh air and silence, the kind of silence that only nature could give. I packed my gear: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a compact stove, some canned food, a few bottles of water, and basic tools like a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a first aid kit. I also brought a map of the area I planned to explore, a small notebook, and a pen. I had no phone signal where I was headed, so I prepared to be completely disconnected. The drive was long but calming. The city slowly dissolved behind me as I took the winding road through the hills and dense forests. I kept my windows down, letting the fresh wind blow through the car. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. Birds sang overhead, and every now and then, I saw a deer or a rabbit dart across the road. It was exactly what I wanted. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset. The place was small, tucked away at the edge of a vast forest with towering pines and oaks. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, and the air was cool and fresh. I chose a flat spot away from the main path, near a slow-moving creek. The sound of the water trickling over smooth stones was peaceful and would lull me to sleep later. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows and bathing everything in warm golden light. Setting up the tent took me longer than I expected. I'm not the most experienced camper, but I was careful. I hammered the stakes into the ground with precise strikes, making sure the fabric was taut and the rainfly secured. I arranged my sleeping bag inside, along with my small pillow and a couple of extra blankets just in case the temperature dropped. I set up the stove nearby, in a cleared area away from dry leaves and twigs to avoid any fire hazard. As darkness fell, I built a small campfire. The crackling flames cast flickering light over the trees and my gear. I had gathered some dry twigs and branches earlier, and the smell of burning would mixed with the fresh scent of pine. I boiled water for my canned soup and ate slowly, savoring the warmth and quiet. After eating, I sat back on a log and just watched the stars appear one by one in the night sky. The Milky Way stretched across the blackness like a dusty band, and the silence around me was complete, except for the soft sounds of crickets and the creek. Later, I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, feeling the cool night air on my face before the warmth of the bag wrapped around me. I was tired but content. As I lay there, I could hear small noises in the forest, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, an occasional bird calling far away. Nothing seemed threatening, just the normal sounds of the woods at night. I felt a peaceful kind of isolation that I hadn't experienced in years. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind moving the branches, but then I heard a crunching sound. Footsteps, maybe, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding hard in my chest. The noise was coming from outside the tent, not very far away. I switched on my flashlight and pointed it at the tent's fabric walls, but all I could see was darkness and shadows. I tried to calm myself down. The woods were alive with animals. It was probably a deer or a raccoon looking for food. I kept the flashlight steady and listened closely. The footsteps stopped near the edge of the campfire light I had left burning low. Then silence. I stayed awake for hours after that, my flashlight in hand, ready for anything. My mind was racing with possibilities, but I refused to let fear take over. I reminded myself that this was nature, and I was just a visitor. By early morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, turning everything a soft orange. I breathed deeply, feeling the fresh air fill my lungs. The world seemed different in the daylight, less intimidating and more alive. I crawled out of my tent and looked around. There were no signs of any visitors from the night. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing that suggested anyone had come close to my camp. The fire had burned low, but it hadn't gone out. I made breakfast using my stove to heat water for coffee and warming some oatmeal. I took my time, savoring the simple meal and the peaceful surroundings. The creek's gentle murmur was soothing, and the birds were more active now, flitting between branches and calling out to each other. I spent the morning hiking around the area. The forest was dense but inviting, with patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy. I followed narrow trails, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. Every now and then, I stopped to examine a plant or watch an insect crawling along a leaf. I wanted to remember this place, to connect with it. I found a fallen log covered in moss and sat there for a while, feeling the rough bark beneath my fingers and listening to the sounds around me. As the day went on, I explored further but kept an eye on the time. I didn't want to be too far from camp when night came again. The forest was beautiful but unpredictable. I took pictures with my phone to capture the moment, though I knew the memories would stay with me longer than any photo. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I collected some firewood and prepared for the night. This time, I felt more confident. I arranged the wood carefully, making sure I had enough for a long fire. I cleaned my campsite, picking up any trash or leftover food. The last thing I wanted was to attract unwanted animals. The second night was colder than the first. I layered my clothes and zipped my sleeping bag tightly around me. The fire crackled loudly, casting dancing shadows on the trees. I stayed awake for a while longer, reading from my notebook by the firelight. I wrote about the day, about the peace and the quiet, about the strange feeling of being so far from everything familiar. At some point, I noticed movement at the edge of the firelight again. This time, it wasn't footsteps but something larger, maybe a deer or a small group of animals. They moved carefully, sniffing the air, probably attracted by the warmth or the smell of food. I didn't panic. I just watched quietly. The animals didn't come close to the fire and soon disappeared back into the dark forest. Eventually, I fell asleep with the fire dying down and the night sounds all around me. The third day was clear and sunny. I decided to pack up and head back home. I didn't want to push my luck by staying longer, especially alone. Breaking camp took longer than setting it up. I rolled up my sleeping bag, packed my tent, and stacked all my gear carefully in the car. I made sure I left no trace of my stay, clearing the fire pit and scattering the ashes in the creek. On my drive back, I felt different, lighter. The stress I'd carried for weeks was gone, replaced by a calm I hadn't expected. The woods had tested me, with silence, isolation, and small moments of uncertainty, but I had come through without losing myself. No ghosts, no monsters, just me, the forest, and the raw truth of being alone in nature. I knew I'd come back, not because I was brave or reckless, but because this kind of peace was rare. Because sometimes you need to disappear from the world for a little while to find yourself again in the quiet rustle of leaves, the slow flow of a creek, and the crackling of a fire under the stars. I had been planning the trip for a while, not because I needed a break or was stressed, but because I had always wanted to try solo camping. I liked the idea of getting away from everything, people, noise, my phone, all of it. I didn't want to sit in a tent and scroll through social media while pretending I was out in the wild. I wanted real silence, real peace, just me, my gear, and the woods. I picked a national forest in Oregon. It wasn't too far from where I lived, about a 3-hour drive. But it was remote enough that you could hike for miles and not see anyone. I did my research, bought all the necessary gear, packed light but smart, and set aside 5 days. I left on a Wednesday morning so that I'd miss any weekend hikers or families. I wanted real solitude. When I arrived, I parked at a small gravel lot at the end of a forest road. There was no ranger station there, just a faded map posted on a wooden board and a metal box for registration forms. I filled out the little slip, stuck it in the slot, slung my pack over my shoulder, and started walking. The trail I followed wasn't well maintained, but that was part of the appeal. It cut deep through thick pine and fir trees, past patches of ferns and moss-covered logs. The further I went, the quieter everything got. The only sounds were my footsteps, the occasional squirrel rustling in the underbrush, and the wind brushing against the treetops. After about 4 hours of hiking, I turned off the trail and started looking for a flat, hidden spot to set up camp. I found one near a small creek. The ground was soft with pine needles, and there were no signs of recent human activity. Felt perfect. I pitched my tent about 20 yards from the creek, under a big pine tree that offered some shelter from wind and falling debris. I built a small fire ring out of stones, gathered some dry wood, and boiled water for dinner. That night, I sat by the fire until it died down and then crawled into my tent. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the roof of the tent while listening to the sounds outside. The forest never really sleeps. There are always small noises, distant cracks, rustling leaves, but none of it made me uneasy. If anything, I found it calming. The first night passed without anything unusual. I woke up early, stretched my legs, had oatmeal and coffee, and spent the day exploring the area. I didn't follow any trail, just wandered carefully through the forest, marking trees with bits of orange flagging tape so I could find my way back. The terrain wasn't too steep, but it was easy to lose your sense of direction among all the trees. I saw deer tracks, lots of birds, and even a bald eagle flying overhead. Around noon, I made it back to camp, ate lunch, and then decided to sit by the creek for a while. I brought a small book but spent most of the time just watching the water flow over rocks. That second night was when I noticed something odd. I had gone to bed early, probably around 9. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't cold, I wasn't having a nightmare, and I didn't need to use the bathroom. I was just awake, wide awake, and I didn't know why. The forest was quiet, more quiet than usual. I couldn't hear the creek anymore, even though it was only a short distance away. It wasn't until I focused that I realized what was bothering me. There were no sounds at all, no insects, no owls, no wind, just stillness. I lay there, frozen, not moving or even breathing heavily. I was trying to listen for something, anything that would explain the silence. Then I heard it, a branch maybe 30 feet from my tent, snapping underfoot. Not falling from a tree, but cracking under pressure, like someone stepping on it. It wasn't a big crack, but it was clear. After that, nothing. I kept waiting for another sound, some movement, but everything went silent again. I stayed awake for hours, staring up at the roof of my tent, listening, waiting, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I must have drifted off because when I opened my eyes again, it was morning. I got out of the tent and walked the perimeter of my camp. Nothing was out of place. No signs of animals, no footprints, no broken branches. The only tracks I found were my own. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been nearby. Maybe a deer had wandered close and gotten spooked. That was the most logical explanation, so I tried to leave it at that. That day, I decided not to go far. I stayed around camp, chopped more wood, double-checked my gear, and did a bit of fishing in the creek. I didn't catch anything, but it helped pass the time. I had a fire again that night and stayed up a little later, keeping the flames going until I was too tired to keep my eyes open. I crawled into my tent and told myself not to overthink things. That night, I woke up again. This time, I heard what sounded like light footsteps. They were slow and uneven, like someone trying to move carefully. They came from the direction of the creek. I stayed perfectly still, heart racing, ears straining to catch every sound. The footsteps came closer, maybe 10 feet away, and then stopped. I didn't hear any breathing, no movement, nothing. Just silence again. I didn't dare unzip the tent. I didn't want whoever or whatever it was to know I was awake. I lay there for what felt like hours. No more sounds came. When the light finally started to seep through the tent walls, I finally moved. When I stepped outside, the fire pit was cold. My gear was untouched. I walked in a wide circle again, checking for prints, disturbed dirt, anything. Nothing. No tracks, not even from an animal. Just quiet woods and the soft murmur of the creek. It almost made me feel like I imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. I knew what I heard. By the fourth day, I wasn't enjoying myself anymore. I was constantly on edge, turning my head at every sound, second-guessing every little movement in the trees. I debated packing up early, but I told myself I had one night left and I could handle it. I didn't want to quit just because I got spooked. I spent the day gathering wood and stacking it up near the fire ring. I sharpened the small knife I kept on my belt. I didn't have a gun, but I had a flare and a whistle. I went to bed that night fully dressed, boots on, with the knife tucked into my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep, not even a little. I lay there in the dark, eyes wide, heart thudding in my chest. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, methodical. This time from the opposite side, coming from the trees. Then silence. Then a single, very light scratch on the side of my tent, like a fingernail on fabric. Just once. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then nothing. I waited until the first light started to show. I didn't eat. I didn't boil water. I broke down camp in under 10 minutes. I didn't even roll up the tent, just stuffed it into my pack. I left the firewood, the rocks, even my book. I started walking fast, checking behind me every few minutes. The trail seemed longer on the way back. The woods felt darker, more narrow. Every sound made me flinch. A bird flying out of a bush nearly made me fall over. I didn't stop for a break. I didn't eat. I just walked, fast, non-stop, until I saw the parking lot through the trees. When I got to my car, I dropped my pack into the back seat and locked all the doors. I sat there for a few minutes trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, and my shirt was soaked with sweat. I turned on the engine and drove without looking back. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't know what to say. Nothing technically happened. I didn't see anyone. I wasn't attacked. Nothing was taken. But something was out there with me. Something that moved like a person, stayed quiet like a person, but didn't act like someone who wanted to say hello. Whoever it was had plenty of chances to make themselves known. They didn't. They watched. They waited. That's what scared me the most. A few weeks later, I read an article online about missing hikers in that forest. Not many, just a few over the years. Nothing that made headlines. The article was short, mostly about how easy it is to get lost. But one part stuck out. One of the searchers mentioned finding a campsite deep in the woods. It had been abandoned quickly, the tent left standing, firewood stacked neatly beside a cold pit. The ranger said it didn't look like the person had planned to leave, but there was no sign of a struggle. No sign of anyone, really. The name of the person wasn't released. I don't know if it was near my spot or not. The article didn't give details, but it was enough. I haven't been back to the woods since. I still go hiking sometimes, but only on busy trails, never alone, and never overnight. I think about that trip more than I want to. The silence, the slow footsteps, the scratch on the tent. Somewhere out there, someone's watching those woods. Maybe they've been doing it for years. Maybe they're still out there right now, waiting. I don't need to know why. I just know I won't be going back. I decided to go camping alone in late October, which most people wouldn't think was a good time, but I liked how quiet the forests were that time of year. No bugs, no crowds, just the sounds of wind and leaves and the dry rustle of trees shedding the last of their color. I picked a spot in western North Carolina, in the mountains near a place called Ridges Cove. It wasn't an official campground. It was a little ways off from one, a few miles in by foot, off an old trail I had hiked the year before. I took a Friday off work, packed my gear Thursday night, and left home early the next morning. The drive was long but peaceful. I had my sleeping bag, tent, a small stove, freeze-dried meals, a solar battery for charging my phone, and enough water and supplies for 3 full days. I parked at a lot near the trailhead and hiked in just before noon. The air was cool and dry, and the sunlight came through the trees in long golden angles. The leaves were mostly brown and orange, some curled and scattered on the path. Everything smelled like dry bark and distant rain. I reached the spot I had in mind by late afternoon. It was a flat patch of ground above a rocky slope, looking down into a thick forest of pine and oak. No one else was around. I pitched my tent, unrolled my bag, and set my small food stash on a boulder a few yards away. The sun dipped fast. I boiled water for a freeze-dried chili meal and sat watching the sky go from pink to steel gray. The air got cold quick, so I put on a jacket and lit a small fire with twigs and some dry bark I found near a fallen tree. That night, I heard nothing but wind through the branches. I slept well. The second day, I woke up with frost on the inside of my tent. My breath looked like smoke. I boiled water for instant coffee and sat by the fire pit, warming my hands. The woods were quiet. I decided to explore deeper into the woods past the slope. I took a small pack with water, a knife, my phone with the GPS on, and marked my camp on it just in case. I hiked down through the trees, stepping over logs and roots, moving slowly and taking note of anything unusual so I wouldn't get lost. It was beautiful, cold, silent, and still. The sun stayed low, so the shadows stretched out ahead of me. I saw deer tracks in the mud near a small stream and even found a pile of scat that looked fresh. I kept going, not too far, maybe half a mile before I turned around. I'd gone far enough to get a sense of how empty the area was. That was one of the reasons I liked going solo. No one to bother me. No yelling kids, no music, no talking. Just the sound of boots on dry leaves. When I got back, I made a fire again, warmed up some rice and beans from a pouch, and sat looking at the stars. That night it got colder. I wore a beanie to bed and kept my jacket on inside my sleeping bag. I heard a few twigs snap in the distance while I lay there, but it didn't bother me. Could have been deer. I was used to that sound. The third morning is when something started to feel strange. I woke up with this dull headache, maybe from the cold, maybe dehydration. I drank water and sat outside to eat a granola bar. I noticed the food stash on the boulder was gone. Not scattered, gone. I had tied the bag shut and wedged it under a rock, but now it was just gone. Nothing left behind, not even the packaging. I looked around, walked a few feet in each direction, but found nothing. No claw marks, no torn pieces, not even footprints. It didn't make sense. I kept telling myself maybe a raccoon had dragged it off in the night and I just wasn't seeing the trail it left. But raccoons usually tear into stuff on the spot. Even bears usually leave scraps. This was just gone. I still had a couple meal pouches in my pack and some snacks, so I figured I'd be fine for one more night. I had planned to hike back the next day anyway, but that whole day I felt on edge. The woods weren't just quiet, they felt wrong, like the silence was too thick. I heard movement in the trees a few times, off to the side or behind me when I was collecting firewood. I never saw anything, but it didn't feel like deer. There was a stillness after each sound, like something waiting. At one point I thought I saw someone standing far off through the trees, just beyond where the light faded. But when I blinked, they were gone. I chalked it up to nerves or maybe the cold playing tricks. I didn't go far that day, just stayed near camp, kept the fire going, and checked my phone GPS more than usual, even though I wasn't moving. I didn't want to admit I was uneasy, but I didn't want to sleep that night, but I had to. I double-checked the area, tied up the rest of my food and gear high on a tree branch, then zipped up in my bag with my headlamp beside me. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a sound outside, a soft crunch, then another, slow, measured. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Then I heard what I swear was the sound of something sniffing, close to the tent. Just one long sniff, then silence. I stayed still, not even breathing. My knife was inside my boot near my feet, but I didn't reach for it. I didn't want to make any noise. The sniffing didn't return. After maybe 10 minutes, I heard the sound of something walking away. Slow, calm footsteps on dry leaves, fading further and further. When the sun came up, I got out of my tent and looked around. Nothing was touched. No footprints. Nothing missing from the tree branch. But there was a smell in the air, faint, but sharp, like sweat. Not animal, human, but no sign of anyone. I started packing. I had enough. I wanted out. I rolled up the tent, packed everything into my bag, and was ready to go by 8 a.m. I checked my phone. The GPS was working. I marked my direction and started hiking back up the trail. About 30 minutes in, I saw something on the ground ahead of me. A boot print, not mine. The heel was deeper than my tread, and it was pointed toward where I had come from. Someone else had been on the trail, but going the other way. I kept walking. 10 minutes later, I saw another print, then another, and they weren't all going the same direction. Whoever it was, they had walked back and forth, like pacing. I didn't stop. I moved faster, only slowing down when I came to switchbacks. I didn't feel alone. Felt like I was being watched. That part of the forest got quiet again, almost like the day before. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots. About halfway back, the trail dipped down to cross a shallow creek. That's when I saw it. Across the water, just barely visible between two trees, was a small structure. I hadn't seen it before, and it wasn't marked on any map I had checked before coming out. It looked like an old shack or hunting blind, made of weathered wood. It had no windows, just a single door that hung slightly open. Something about it made my skin crawl. I didn't go near it. I kept going, fast. By the time I reached the parking area, my nerves were shot. My car was right where I left it. No damage, nothing missing. But as I opened the trunk and put my pack inside, I noticed something that made me freeze. There was a smear of dirt on the driver's side window. A handprint, wide, long-fingered, with dry soil pressed into the glass. It wasn't there when I left. It hadn't rained. Nothing could have smudged it by accident. I stood there, just staring at it for a long time. Then I got in and locked the doors. I drove for hours without stopping, not even for gas until the tank light came on. Even then, I picked a station near a big town. I didn't look at the woods again during the drive. When I got home, I took the car through a wash, then wiped down the windows myself. That handprint didn't come off easily. It had sunk into the pores of the glass like it had been there for years. I had to scrub it hard with cleaner and a blade before it faded. That was 6 months ago. I haven't gone camping since. I don't know if someone was watching me the whole time or if I stumbled into an area they thought was theirs. Maybe that shack was a hunting hideout. Maybe not. But the food that disappeared without a trace, the sniffing outside my tent, the pacing prints, and the handprint on the glass, they all point to someone being there. The worst part is knowing how easy it would have been for them to do something worse. I was miles from help, no one around, no signal most of the time. All they had to do was wait for me to fall asleep. But they didn't. I don't think it was kindness. I think they were just watching, like I was a test, or a warning. And that's what stuck with me the most. That there are people out there who don't need to hurt you to scare you. They just need to let you know you were never alone. I took some time off in early September to get away from everything. Work had been building up for months and I hadn't taken a real break in over a year. I felt burnout, disconnected, and just tired of noise. Phones ringing, emails buzzing, traffic, crowds. I needed a place where I wouldn't hear a single engine, where I could fall asleep without headlights sweeping across my walls or people yelling outside their windows at midnight. That's how I landed on the idea of going solo camping deep in the forests of northern Montana. I picked a national forest area I'd found online, big enough to let me disappear into it for a few days. I marked out a few trails and lakes on a paper map, planned where I'd park and hike in, and packed everything I'd need to be out there for 4 days. I had my tent, food, water filter, a bear canister, emergency gear, and a GPS tracker. I even bought a new knife and a solid headlamp. I wasn't trying to take any chances. I wanted to unplug, but I still wanted to be smart about it. The drive out was long and quiet. I started early in the morning, and by early afternoon I had turned off the paved roads onto dusty logging tracks. The deeper I drove into the woods, the fewer tire tracks I saw. Eventually, I reached the small pullout where I planned to leave my car. It was nothing more than a widening in the dirt road, but it was far enough off the main routes that I was sure no one else would park there. I locked the car, slung on my pack, and started hiking. The first few hours on the trail were exactly what I wanted. Nothing but trees, the sound of the wind, and the occasional bird call. The air smelled clean, pine and moss and dry earth. I followed an old trail that barely looked used, stepping over fallen branches and ducking under sagging trees. By the time I reached a small clearing near a creek, I was sweating but satisfied. I pitched my tent under a big spruce, filtered some water from the stream, and made a simple meal. As the sun dipped below the treeline, the temperature dropped fast. I zipped into my sleeping bag early, staring through the mesh roof of my tent as the stars came out one by one. I don't remember falling asleep. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up once or twice, hearing the usual forest sounds. Twigs snapping in the distance, maybe a small animal moving around, the wind. Nothing out of the ordinary. I got up with the light and made coffee over my little camp stove. Everything felt calm. I left most of my gear at the camp and went on a long hike that day, following a game trail up a ridge to get a better view of the area. I spent hours up there, just walking and sitting and letting my mind go blank. Felt good. I didn't check my phone once. I didn't even bring it. That night, though, I started to notice little things. When I got back to camp around sunset, something felt slightly off. My tent was exactly where I left it, but my bear canister, which I'd wedged under a tree root, was moved. Not far, maybe a foot or two, but it wasn't where I'd left it. At first, I thought it had just shifted. Maybe I hadn't wedged it as tightly as I thought. But when I bent down to look, there were faint scuff marks in the dirt near it. I figured maybe a raccoon had tried to get into it and given up. Still, the lid was still locked and the canister didn't look chewed or scratched. I tried to shrug it off. Animals do weird things. That's part of camping. That night I had trouble sleeping. The wind picked up, and every gust made the trees creak. I could hear branches tapping each other high above, the distant rustle of dry leaves. But beneath that, every once in a while, I thought I heard something else, like slow crunching in the underbrush, long pauses between each step. I stayed still and listened. Whatever it wasn't close, just somewhere out in the darkness, moving in slow, heavy steps. Not fast or frantic, just steady, quiet, and far enough away that I couldn't be sure if it was real or my imagination. I stayed awake for a long time. In the morning, I stepped out into a cold fog. Everything was damp. My tent, my pack, even my boots felt clammy. I moved slowly, making breakfast just to warm up. I walked down to the creek to refill my water, and when I came back, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. About 30 feet from my tent, off behind a fallen log, there were boot prints in the soft dirt. They weren't mine. I had only been going back and forth between the tent and the creek. These prints led in from the trees, circled behind my camp, and disappeared again into the woods. I stood there, holding my water bottle, heart thudding. The prints were faint but real, slightly deeper at the heel, like someone walking quietly, carefully. I crouched and looked closer. They were wide, like a man's, and spaced evenly. Whoever made them hadn't run. They had walked right behind my tent. I looked around in every direction, but everything was quiet. The fog muffled sound made everything feel far away. I packed up most of my gear and stuffed it into my pack, just in case. I left my tent up but kept my essentials ready. I debated leaving right then, but a part of me wanted to believe it was just some other camper who wandered nearby without realizing I was there. Maybe someone got turned around in the fog. Still, I didn't go far that day. I stayed close to camp, never out of sight of my tent. I kept listening. The fog cleared by mid-morning, but the strange feeling stuck with me. Every movement in the trees made me look twice. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. That night, I didn't sleep much at all. I lay in my bag, completely still, with my headlamp and knife beside me. I turned off my light early and listened. For a while, there was nothing but the breeze and the stream. Then, deep into the night, I heard the soft crunch of steps again. Closer this time. They moved slowly, stopping now and then. I couldn't tell where they were exactly. Maybe behind my tent again, maybe on the other side of the creek. I held my breath. The steps were too slow for a deer or bear. They were careful, like someone deliberately trying to move without sound. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours. Just before dawn, I finally dozed off for maybe 30 minutes. When I woke up, it was already light. I unzipped the tent and stepped out quickly, checking the area. Again, I saw more prints. Closer this time. One of them was only a few feet from my tent, near where I kept my stove and food bag. Nothing was missing, but I had the same sinking feeling in my stomach I'd had the day before. This time I didn't wait. I packed everything, fast and messy. I didn't care how I shoved things into my pack. I just wanted to move. I didn't even eat. I left the campsite and started hiking back toward my car. I didn't take breaks, didn't stop to drink. I just walked, glancing back more than I wanted to admit. The trail felt different going out. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt quiet in the wrong way. I kept seeing broken branches that looked fresh, areas of trampled underbrush, Small things that might not have meant anything on their own. But when you're already paranoid, every sound feels like a threat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I made it back to my car late that afternoon. It was exactly where I'd left it. Nothing touched. I tossed my pack into the trunk, climbed in, and locked the doors before I even took a breath. The drive back out felt longer than the way in. Every turn in the road made me expect someone standing there. But I didn't see anyone. I didn't stop until I hit the first gas station 2 towns away. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. What was I going to say? That someone walked near my camp? That I heard footsteps at night? It didn't sound like much when I said it out loud. But I knew what I felt. I camped alone before many times. I knew what normal forest noises were. This wasn't that. Someone had found me out there. Someone had watched me for more than one night. They hadn't taken anything or made a sound. They hadn't left a note or a sign. They just watched. That's what scared me more than anything. It's been almost a year since that trip. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still go on hikes, still love the outdoors, but I don't sleep in the woods alone anymore. I think about that trip more often than I'd like. Not because something terrible happened, because it didn't. That's the part that gets under your skin. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a storm or an accident. It was just someone out there, choosing to stay silent, choosing to stay hidden, walking slowly behind my tent while I slept. That's what I remember when I lie awake at night. The footsteps, the quiet, and the thought that they could have done anything and chose not to. That's what still makes my skin crawl. I parked my truck on the side of a gravel pull-off just before the road turned into a narrow dirt trail. It wasn't an official camping site, but I had researched the area online for a few weeks and saw a few people mention dispersed camping being allowed up here. The place was in northern Arizona, far enough from Phoenix that I wouldn't run into crowds, but not so deep into the mountains that it felt like a survival trip. I had 2 full days off and wanted to just get away from everything. No people, no phone calls, no traffic. I packed light: tent, sleeping bag, 1 cooler with food and water, small propane stove, flashlight, small hatchet, change of clothes, and a couple of protein bars in my backpack. I left a note on my kitchen table at home, just in case. I always did that before heading out alone. It just said the area I was headed to, the date, and that I should be back by Sunday evening. The air was warm but not hot. Late September, dry wind, no humidity. Perfect camping weather. I hiked for about 1.5 miles before I found a good flat spot under a group of tall pines. There were signs that someone else had camped there before. Flattened grass, a ring of blackened rocks used for a fire pit, but it looked like no one had been there in weeks. I dropped my pack, set up the tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some dry wood from around the site. I didn't make a fire that first night. There was a burn advisory in the area and I didn't want to risk anything. I cooked some pasta over the propane stove, ate it straight from the pot, and sipped a warm bottle of water while listening to the wind through the trees. It got dark fast. I sat in my camp chair with my flashlight propped on my lap and watched the sky turn from pale blue to deep purple, then black. The only sounds were bugs and wind. Eventually I crawled into my tent and zipped up the flap. I wasn't tired yet, but there wasn't much to do. I turned off the flashlight and just lay there on my back, staring up at the faint outline of the tent ceiling. I could hear distant creaking from the trees above, branches rubbing together. It reminded me of when I used to camp with my dad as a kid, just the 2 of us, out in the woods for weekends at a time. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps, not heavy ones. They were light, careful, but very real. I froze and held my breath. They were close, less than 30 feet from the tent, maybe less. I didn't hear talking, just steps, then nothing, no sound at all. I stayed still for maybe 10 minutes. Then I slowly reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't get out, just sat there with the light off and on again, trying to decide if I'd imagined it or not. Eventually I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon. There were lots of those up here. I left the flashlight on and pointed at the flap, then lay back down. I finally fell asleep sometime near 3 a.m. The next morning, I walked around the edge of the site and found prints. Not animal ones. These were clear boot prints in the dirt and pine needles. They led down the slope, away from the tent, and disappeared into thicker brush. I knelt down and touched one of them. It hadn't rained, so the edges were sharp. Not even dry enough to flake apart when I brushed it with my fingers. Someone had been walking through my site during the night. I felt a chill climb up my spine. I looked around, trying to listen for anything, but it was dead quiet. Still, no breeze, just tall trees and open sky. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I didn't want to feel like I was running from nothing. Maybe it was just a hiker passing through. Maybe they saw my tent and just kept walking. I told myself that all morning while I boiled water and made oatmeal. By noon, I felt a bit better. I hiked down to a dry stream bed I'd seen on the map, maybe half a mile away. It was full of smooth stones and fallen branches. I sat on a rock and watched birds land in the shrubs along the bank. The sun was out, and it felt good on my shoulders. I stayed there for over an hour. When I got back to camp, I noticed the cooler had been moved. It was zipped shut, but it wasn't where I left it. It was about 3 feet off to the side. No food was missing, but the lid had fresh fingerprints near the zipper. I stood there for a while, staring at it. My skin felt tight, like it was being pulled back across my body. I checked the tent. Everything was still inside. The sleeping bag was fine. My backpack was untouched. The propane stove was right where I left it. But someone had definitely come through here. I grabbed my hatchet and just stood there for a few minutes. It was the middle of the day, warm sun, blue sky, but I felt exposed, like I was being watched. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight on low and sat inside the tent with the hatchet beside me. Every small sound outside made me jump. Leaves rustling, branches swaying. I heard steps again, this time slower, more careful. I didn't move. They circled the tent. I could hear them walking in a full loop. Then nothing. I waited an hour before I unzipped the flap and poked my head out. There was no one there. I got maybe an hour of sleep, tops. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed up everything as quickly as I could. I stuffed the sleeping bag into the sack without rolling it. I grabbed my cooler and stove and shoved them into the backpack. I didn't eat, didn't clean up the site. I just wanted to be gone. As I started down the trail, I heard something up ahead, a stick snapping, then another. I froze. There was a person standing about 60 feet away, just off the side of the path. They weren't walking. They were standing still, facing me. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I saw that they were wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. No gear, no backpack, no visible weapon, but something about their stance sent a wave of panic through me. They didn't move. I turned around and started walking the other way, fast. I didn't run, not yet. I just walked as quickly as I could back up the trail, heart slamming in my chest. The trail looped around a hill, and I cut through the trees to shave off time. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just knew I didn't want to be on that trail anymore. I tripped over a root and scraped my knee, but I kept going. I didn't stop until I could see the road where my truck was parked. I dropped my gear beside it, pulled out the keys, and got inside. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped them twice. Once I got the engine started, I backed up so fast I nearly went into a ditch. I got back on the main road and didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't report it. There was no actual crime, no threat, no words spoken, just prints, moved gear, and a stranger watching me. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. I didn't sleep for 2 nights after I got home. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure in the hoodie, just standing still in the trees, waiting, watching. It's been over a year since that trip. I haven't gone camping alone since. I still hike, still visit trails, but I don't sleep outside anymore. A month ago, I looked up news stories from that area. There was a small article, buried in a local site, about a man's truck found abandoned not far from the same forest road. No sign of him. His gear was still in the bed of the truck. The article said they didn't suspect foul play, but the search was still ongoing. I don't know if it was the same guy. I don't know if he saw what I saw, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that if I hadn't left that morning, if I had stayed just one more day, I might not have made it back either. It started with a plan I made on a quiet Friday afternoon. I wanted to get away from the noise of the city, the constant buzz of people and traffic, the endless emails and deadlines. My work had been piling up, and my head felt heavy with stress. I needed fresh air and silence, the kind of silence that only nature could give. I packed my gear: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a compact stove, some canned food, a few bottles of water, and basic tools like a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a first aid kit. I also brought a map of the area I planned to explore, a small notebook, and a pen. I had no phone signal where I was headed, so I prepared to be completely disconnected. The drive was long but calming. The city slowly dissolved behind me as I took the winding road through the hills and dense forests. I kept my windows down, letting the fresh wind blow through the car. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. Birds sang overhead, and every now and then, I saw a deer or a rabbit dart across the road. It was exactly what I wanted. I arrived at the campsite just before sunset. The place was small, tucked away at the edge of a vast forest with towering pines and oaks. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, and the air was cool and fresh. I chose a flat spot away from the main path, near a slow-moving creek. The sound of the water trickling over smooth stones was peaceful and would lull me to sleep later. The sun was dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows and bathing everything in warm golden light. Setting up the tent took me longer than I expected. I'm not the most experienced camper, but I was careful. I hammered the stakes into the ground with precise strikes, making sure the fabric was taut and the rainflies secured. I arranged my sleeping bag inside, along with my small pillow and a couple of extra blankets just in case the temperature dropped. I set up the stove nearby, in a cleared area away from dry leaves and twigs to avoid any fire hazard. As darkness fell, I built a small campfire. The crackling flames cast flickering light over the trees and my gear. I had gathered some dry twigs and branches earlier, and the smell of burning would mixed with the fresh scent of pine. I boiled water for my canned soup and ate slowly, savoring the warmth and quiet. After eating, I sat back on a log and just watched the stars appear one by one in the night sky. The Milky Way stretched across the blackness like a dusty band, and the silence around me was complete, except for the soft sounds of crickets and the creek. Later, I zipped myself into the sleeping bag, feeling the cool night air on my face before the warmth of the bag wrapped around me. I was tired but content. As I lay there, I could hear small noises in the forest: twigs snapping, leaves rustling, an occasional bird calling far away. Nothing seemed threatening, just the normal sounds of the woods at night. I felt a peaceful kind of isolation that I hadn't experienced in years. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise. At first, I thought it was the wind moving the branches, but then I heard a crunching sound. Footsteps, maybe, slow and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding hard in my chest. The noise was coming from outside the tent, not very far away. I switched on my flashlight and pointed it at the tent's fabric walls, but all I could see was darkness and shadows. I tried to calm myself down. The woods were alive with animals. It was probably a deer or a raccoon looking for food. I kept the flashlight steady and listened closely. The footsteps stopped near the edge of the campfire light I had left burning low. Then silence. I stayed awake for hours after that, my flashlight in hand, ready for anything. My mind was racing with possibilities, but I refused to let fear take over. I reminded myself that this was nature, and I was just a visitor. By early morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, turning everything a soft orange. I breathed deeply, feeling the fresh air fill my lungs. The world seemed different in the daylight, less intimidating and more alive. I crawled out of my tent and looked around. There were no signs of any visitors from the night. No footprints, no disturbed leaves, nothing that suggested anyone had come close to my camp. The fire had burned low, but it hadn't gone out. I made breakfast using my stove to heat water for coffee and warming some oatmeal. I took my time, savoring the simple meal and the peaceful surroundings. The creek's gentle murmur was soothing, and the birds were more active now, flitting between branches and calling out to each other. I spent the morning hiking around the area. The forest was dense but inviting, with patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy. I followed narrow trails, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. Every now and then, I stopped to examine a plant or watch an insect crawling along a leaf. I wanted to remember this place, to connect with it. I found a fallen log covered in moss and sat there for a while, feeling the rough bark beneath my fingers and listening to the sounds around me. As the day went on, I explored further but kept an eye on the time. I didn't want to be too far from camp when night came again. The forest was beautiful but unpredictable. I took pictures with my phone to capture the moment, though I knew the memories would stay with me longer than any photo. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I collected some firewood and prepared for the night. This time, I felt more confident. I arranged the wood carefully, making sure I had enough for a long fire. I cleaned my campsite, picking up any trash or leftover food. The last thing I wanted was to attract unwanted animals. The second night was colder than the first. I layered my clothes and zipped my sleeping bag tightly around me. The fire crackled loudly, casting dancing shadows on the trees. I stayed awake for a while longer, reading from my notebook by the firelight. I wrote about the day, about the peace and the quiet, about the strange feeling of being so far from everything familiar. At some point, I noticed movement at the edge of the firelight again. This time, it wasn't footsteps but something larger, maybe a deer or a small group of animals. They moved carefully, sniffing the air, probably attracted by the warmth or the smell of food. I didn't panic. I just watched quietly. The animals didn't come close to the fire and soon disappeared back into the dark forest. Eventually, I fell asleep with the fire dying down and the night sounds all around me. The third day was clear and sunny. I decided to pack up and head back home. I didn't want to push my luck by staying longer, especially alone. Breaking camp took longer than setting it up. I rolled up my sleeping bag, packed my tent, and stacked all my gear carefully in the car. I made sure I left no trace of my stay, clearing the fire pit and scattering the ashes in the creek. On my drive back, I felt different, lighter. The stress I'd carried for weeks was gone, replaced by a calm I hadn't expected. The woods had tested me, with silence, isolation, and small moments of uncertainty. But I had come through without losing myself. No ghosts, no monsters, just me, the forest, and the raw truth of being alone in nature. I knew I'd come back, not because I was brave or reckless, but because this kind of peace was rare. Because sometimes you need to disappear from the world for a little while to find yourself again in the quiet rustle of leaves, the slow flow of a creek, and the crackling of a fire under the stars. I had been planning that solo camping trip for a while. After months of sitting in an office with artificial lights and recycled air, I needed something that felt real. I wanted quiet, I wanted space, and I wanted to feel small under the sky again. I'd been out camping alone before, a few times in my 20s and early 30s, but now at 38, I felt like I had to prove to myself I could still do it. I wasn't trying to go off-grid forever or anything dramatic. I just wanted a few days in the woods where no one could bother me. I chose a remote national forest area in northern Montana. I didn't want a campground with kids riding bikes or people playing music. I wanted complete stillness. I found a stretch of public land near a small, shallow lake that looked untouched based on satellite maps. The nearest dirt road ended almost 2 miles from the lake, and there were no trails leading to it. It looked perfect. I spent a couple of weeks gathering gear. I double-checked my pack list several times: tent, food, water filter, GPS, knife, fire starter, med kit, bear spray, even extra batteries for the headlamp. I didn't want to take chances. I told my brother where I'd be and left him a map with coordinates. I planned to be gone for 5 nights. The drive out was long. I left just after dawn and reached the dirt road by mid-afternoon. The road was rough, full of washouts and sharp turns, and by the time I pulled over and parked on the shoulder, I already felt far away from everything. No cell service, just tall pines, thick underbrush, and air that smelled like sap and old rain. I locked the truck, slung on my pack, and started walking. The hike to the lake wasn't easy. The forest was dense, and I had to push through tangles of branches and fallen logs. I was sweating hard within minutes. I stopped a few times to check the GPS and make sure I was heading the right way. The sun filtered through the trees in patches, and every now and then I'd hear the flutter of birds taking off or the crack of a branch under something's foot. Maybe a deer. I didn't see another person the whole way. When I finally reached the lake, it was even better than I'd imagined. The water was calm and clear, with lilies floating near the shore. I couldn't hear a single human sound. I picked a flat spot a few yards back from the water and set up my tent. It was mid-evening by the time I got my fire going and cooked some food. I sat on a log and watched the sky turn orange, then purple, then black. I could see more stars than I'd seen in years. The silence was total. It was exactly what I'd wanted. The first night passed without much happening. I woke a few times to the sound of wind through the trees or small rustlings in the brush, normal forest sounds. My tent held up fine, and the air was cool but not cold. I boiled water in the morning, had instant oatmeal, and took my time exploring around the lake. I didn't see any footprints or signs that people had ever been there. I felt like I'd found a place no one else knew about. That second day, I hiked to a nearby ridge just to get some elevation and check out the surroundings. It gave me a better sense of how isolated I really was. I couldn't see any buildings, power lines, or roads, just layers of green hills and a long stretch of trees going on forever. I stayed up there for an hour, eating jerky and trail mix, then made my way back to camp. Everything still felt good. That night, I started noticing little things. Just before bed, I heard a sharp cracking sound from the far side of the lake, not like a branch falling on its own. This was quick and deliberate, like something heavy had stepped wrong. I froze and waited. There was no follow-up sound, just that single snap. I sat by the fire a little longer, looking out over the dark water, trying to convince myself it was nothing. A bear maybe, or a moose, something wild but not interested in me. I kept the bear spray close and slept with my knife near my hand. The third day felt slightly off. I couldn't really explain it, but something had changed. I felt watched. I checked the shoreline, walked the length of it, and looked for tracks, but found nothing. No broken branches or prints or anything. Still, every now and then I turned fast, thinking something was behind me. My skin felt prickly, and I kept scanning the woods. I made myself a fire early and sat by it most of the afternoon. That night, I didn't sleep much. The forest felt too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. I heard something again, more movement near the far side of the lake. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't random either. It had rhythm, like footsteps, not fast, not heavy, but steady. I sat up in the tent and gripped my knife. I stayed like that for what felt like hours. I didn't want to use the flashlight and give away my position. I just sat there in the dark, breathing slow and listening. The steps faded eventually, and I must have dozed off near dawn. By morning, I felt shaken. I told myself it was all in my head, just the isolation getting to me. I forced myself to go through the motions, breakfast, boiling water, checking gear, but I couldn't relax. I kept looking into the trees. I packed a day bag and went for a long hike inland, hoping the movement and effort would wear off the nerves. It helped a little, but even miles away from camp, I felt off balance, like something unseen was nearby. When I returned in the late afternoon, something was wrong. My fire pit had been disturbed. The stones around it were knocked slightly out of place, and there were fresh scratches in the dirt. Nothing had been taken. My food was still tied in the bear bag, untouched, but someone had been there. I stood still for a long time, just looking at the mess. My gut turned cold. I went through the rest of my gear. Everything inside the tent was how I left it. The water filter, the pack, the extra clothes, nothing had been moved. It wasn't an animal. The scratches in the dirt had a pattern to them, like someone had poked around with a stick or a knife. I stared at them, trying to picture who would come out this far, find my camp, and just mess with the fire pit without taking anything. That night was the worst. I built a bigger fire than usual and sat with my back against a tree, facing the lake. I didn't go in the tent. I didn't sleep. I held the knife in one hand and the bear spray in the other and waited. Around midnight, I heard the steps again, this time closer. They moved slowly along the edge of the lake, just past where the firelight reached. I couldn't see anything, but I heard the distinct sound of feet shifting in dry leaves. Not an animal, too deliberate. Then they stopped. No splash, no retreating steps, just silence. I stayed frozen like that until dawn. As soon as there was enough light, I packed up. I didn't cook breakfast or boil water. I jammed everything into the pack, took down the tent without folding it right, and hiked out. I kept checking behind me as I walked. I didn't stop for water or snacks. I just moved as fast as I could through the woods, following the GPS until I finally saw my truck through the trees. When I reached it, the relief hit hard. I threw the pack in the bed and got in without even brushing off the mud. I started the engine and turned around on that narrow dirt road with my heart pounding. I didn't relax until I was on the highway with bars on my phone again. I pulled over in the next town and sat in a gas station parking lot, just breathing. I didn't tell anyone the full story. When people asked how the trip went, I said it was fine but cut short because of the weather. I didn't know how to explain it in a way that didn't sound paranoid. There was no proof, nothing taken, no photos, just a fire pit moved slightly, strange footsteps, and a constant feeling that something was just out of sight. That was 3 years ago. I haven't been camping alone since. I still hike sometimes, but only during the day and only on marked trails. I tried going back to the woods once, just a small local park. But the first time a branch snapped in the distance, I felt my chest tighten and had to turn back. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't anything supernatural. It was someone who found me out there, watched me, and didn't leave a trace. Someone who wanted me to know they were there, but not why. And that's what still keeps me up sometimes. Not knowing what they wanted, only that they were real.